Hi guys, welcome to Bedtime Stories. Tonight we are going to dive headfirst into the chaotic, noisy, overpriced and absolutely magnetic history of New York City. We're going to peel back the concrete, remove the subway rats, and look at how a swampy, hilly island became the center of the universe, or at least the center of its own ego. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please do me a huge favor and hit that like button and subscribe. It honestly helps this new channel so much. It means the world to me. I'm always curious where everyone is listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there right now. I love reading those. It's really cool to see our global community connecting through these stories. Alright. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or heater for that soft white noise. Cuddle up with your dog or cat in your warm bed, and let's ease into tonight's journey. To really understand New York, you have to delete everything you know about it. Erase the skyline. Forget the Empire State Building. It's not there. Wipe away the grid system of the streets. Delete the bodegas, the yellow cabs, the smell of roasting nuts and exhaust fumes. We need to go back way before the Dutch showed up with their wooden shoes and questionable business ethics. We need to go back to the ice. About 20,000 years ago, which in geological time is basically last Tuesday, the area we now call New York was covered by a sheet of ice over 1,000 feet thick. This wasn't a winter wonderland, it was a slow-moving, grinding wall of death. It was the Wisconsin ice sheet, and it acted like nature's bulldozer. It scraped across the land, shearing off tops of hills, and dragging massive boulders from God knows where, depositing them in what would eventually be Central Park. You know those big grey rocks you see people sunbathing on in the park today? Those are glacial, erratic boulders. They are basically geologic luggage left behind at the baggage claim of history. When the ice finally melted and retreated, it left behind a landscape that was rugged, messy, and incredibly diverse. It carved out the deep harbor that would eventually make the city rich. It left a terminal moraine, a pile of rubble that became the backbone of Long Island. But most importantly, it exposed the bedrock, the Manhattan schist. Now, I'm not a geologist, but you have to respect this rock. It's incredibly hard, metamorphic rock that was formed under intense heat and pressure. It's the reason why Midtown has skyscrapers. You can anchor a 100-story building into that stuff, and it won't budge. It's the original foundation of the city's arrogance. If Manhattan had been built on sand or clay, the skyline would look like a suburban strip mall. But because of that ancient, stubborn rock, the city was destined to go vertical. Fast forward a few thousand years. The ice is gone. The water levels have risen. The Hudson River is flowing, though back then it was actually a fjord. It's a massive tidal estuary, meaning the ocean water pushes way upriver. The indigenous people, the Lenape, called the area Mannahatta. Now, let's pause and visualize Mannahatta before the Europeans arrived to ruin the neighborhood vibe. It wasn't the flat pancake of concrete you see today. It was hilly, like really hilly. Mannahatta essentially translates to island of many hills. There were dense forests of oak, chestnut, and hickory. There were meadows. There were streams and freshwater ponds where Times Square is now. Can you imagine that? Instead of blinking LED billboards and guys in knockoff Elmo costumes harassing tourists, There were beavers building dams, and red-winged blackbirds nesting in the reeds. It was ecologically rich, but let's not romanticize it too much. It was a swamp, and swamps mean bugs. If you think New York in August is bad now with the heat radiating off the asphalt, imagine it back then with clouds of mosquitoes the size of small birds, and zero air conditioning. It was humid, it was muddy, and if you weren't careful you could get eaten by a black bear or a wolf in what is now the West Village. The Lenape people managed this land with a light touch, but they weren't invisible. They burned underbrush to clear hunting grounds. They planted maize, beans, and squash, the three sisters. And they harvested oysters. Oh man, the oysters. Before New York was the Big Apple, it was the Big Oyster. The harbour was absolutely paved with oyster beds. We're talking about 350 square miles of oyster reefs. Some of these oysters grew to be the size of dinner plates. If you were a Lenape person standing on the shore of the Gowanus Creek, which back then was a sparkling stream and not a toxic Superfund site that smells like old batteries, you could just wade in and grab a snack that would cost you $24 a cents a dozen at a trendy bistro today. The shells were everywhere. Massive middens or trash piles of shells lined the coast. It was the original New York litter, just calcium carbonate instead of Starbucks cups. But the silence of Manhattan was about to break. Enter the Europeans. Specifically, enter Henry Hudson in 1609. Now, history books often paint explorers as these noble, visionary adventurers. In reality, most of them were just gig workers trying to fulfill a contract so they could get paid. Hudson was English, but he was working for the Dutch East India Company. He was essentially a freelance. His assignment was simple: find a shortcut to Asia. The Europeans were desperate for spices: pepper, cloves, nutmeg. Basically, they wanted to make their bland food taste better without having to pay the markup of going over land or sailing all the way around Africa. Apples 1 was gathered on the morrow. Hudson was sailing the Half Moon, a ship that was small, cramped, and likely smelled horrifying. Imagine a wooden box filled with unwashed men, bilge water, rotting food and livestock, floating in the summer heat. That's the Half Moon. He hits the coast of North America and starts poking around, looking for a passage to the Pacific. He finds this wide, massive river, the Hudson, naturally, and thinks, this is it. This is the way to China. He sails up the river. He sees the Palisades, those massive cliffs on the Jersey side. He trades with a Lenape. He gets all the way up to present-day Albany before the river gets too shallow, and he realizes, damn, this isn't the way to China. This is just a really nice river. So he turns around. He didn't find the spices. He failed his primary objective, but he did find something else. He found furs, specifically beaver furs. Now, to the modern mind, the obsession with beaver fur is bizarre. It's a rodent, it slaps water with its tail, it has buck teeth. But in 17th century Europe, beaver fur was the iPhone of its day. It was the ultimate status symbol. The fur has these tiny barbs that, when processed into felt, make waterproof, durable, and shapeable hats. Everyone who was anyone in Europe needed a beaver hat, and the European beavers had been hunted to near extinction. So Hudson goes back to the Dutch and says, bad news, didn't find China. Good news, I found a place absolutely crawling with furry gold. The Dutch, being the pragmatic, profit-obsessed capitalists they were, didn't care about empire building for the glory of God or king like the Spanish or the French. They were a republic of merchants. They cared about the balance sheet. They looked at the map of this new territory and didn't see a new Netherlands. They saw a branch office. They saw a resource extraction hub. This brings us to the founding of the colony. It wasn't a pilgrimage. It wasn't a flight from religious persecution. It was a corporate startup. The Dutch West India Company was formed, and they set up shop. In 1624, the first settlers arrived. They were mostly Walloons, French-speaking refugees, because the Dutch were having trouble convincing their own comfortable citizens to leave their clean, well-ordered cities to live in a mosquito-infested wilderness on the other side of the world. They initially set up on Governor's Island, then moved to the tip of Manhattan, and here we have the most famous real estate transaction in history, the purchase of Manhattan. The story goes that Peter Minuit bought the island from the Lenape for $24.00 worth of trinkets and beads. We've all heard it. It's the foundational myth of New York, the ultimate hustle. But let's apply our cynical realism lens here. First, the $24.00 figure is a 19th century calculation based on exchange rates that make no sense. But the beads and trinkets part is actually true. Glass beads, metal tools, kettles, cloth. These things were high-tech to the Lenape. A metal axe head doesn't break like a stone one. A metal kettle can sit directly on the fire. These were valuable goods. However, the purchase was a complete failure of communication, a clash of operating systems. The Dutch came from a culture of private property. If you bought land, you put a fence around it, and it was yours. The Lenape came from a culture of land use. You couldn't own the land any more than you could own the air or the ocean. You could only own the rights to use it for a season, to hunt here, to fish there. So when Minuit handed over the goods, the Lenape likely thought, "Cool, these weird pale guys want to share the space with us. We'll take the metal axes, they can camp out on the tip of the island, and we'll both hang out." The Dutch thought, "We now own this island in perpetuity. Get off our lawn." It wasn't a swindle in the traditional sense. It was two different worlds talking past each other. It was a bad contract when neither side read the fine print, because the fine print was written in invisible ink. So the Dutch set up New Amsterdam, and honestly, it was kind of a dump. If you walked through New Amsterdam in the 1640s, you wouldn't be impressed. It was a tiny cluster of thatched-roofed cottages huddled around a fort at the southern tip of the island, where Battery Park is now. The streets were just mud paths that turned into glue when it rained. Pigs roamed freely, eating garbage and occasionally attacking children. It smelled like wood smoke, unwashed bodies, curing animal skins, and pig manure. The population was a mix of rough-and-tumble traders, sailors, pirates, prostitutes, and company men. It was a port town from day one. It was rowdy. It was diverse. Because commerce doesn't care about your language, it cares about your money. By the 1640s, there were already 18 different languages spoken in this tiny settlement of a few hundred people. The centerpiece of the town was the tavern. The Dutch loved their beer, and since the water was brackish and dangerous to drink, everyone, men, women, children, drank weak beer or cider. You can imagine the general productivity levels. But the colony was struggling. It was poorly managed. The directors general sent by the company were usually incompetent bureaucrats who had no idea how to run a frontier town. One of them, Willem Kieft, was particularly disastrous. He decided to start taxing the Lenape and eventually launched a brutal, unprovoked war against them. It was a bloodbath that nearly wiped out the colony. Settlers were terrified to leave the fort. The company town was on the verge of bankruptcy. This is where the geography of modern New York starts to take shape, literally. To protect the northern border of the city from the angry Lenape and the encroaching British, and just the scary wilderness in general, the settlers built a wooden wall. It stretched from the East River to the Hudson River. It was a primitive fortification. In the fight it's too long, stuck vertically into the ground. A glorified fence. But the path that ran alongside that wall became a road, and when the wall eventually came down, the name stuck. That is Wall Street. The financial center of the world is named after a wooden fence built to keep scary things out of a muddy Dutch village. Then there was the canal. The Dutch, being Dutch, couldn't live without a canal. They dug one right through the middle of the settlement to help move goods. They called it the Heerdegracht. It was intended to be like a cute little slice of Amsterdam. In reality, it was a stagnant ditch filled with garbage and sewage. Eventually they got sick of the smell, filled it in, and paved over it. That street was wide because of the canal, so they called it Broad Street. So if you're walking in the financial district today, you are walking on the ghost map of this shoddy little outpost. The colony was chaotic, immoral, and losing money. The Dutch West India Company was not happy. They looked at the balance sheets and saw red. They needed a fixer. They needed someone to come in, crack some skulls, and turn this failing startup into a profitable enterprise. In 1647, they sent Peter Stuyvesant. Stuyvesant is one of those historical figures who is basically a cartoon character come to life. He was a strict Calvinist, a seasoned soldier, and he had a silver-banded wooden peg leg because he'd lost his right leg to a cannonball while fighting the Spanish in the Caribbean. He didn't walk, he stomped. He arrived in New Amsterdam like a new CEO, taking over a failing fraternity house. His first words to the settlers were basically, "I shall govern you as a father governs his children," which in the 17th century meant, "I'm going to beat you until you behave." He looked around at the drunken chaos, the pigs in the streets, the crumbling fort, and he was disgusted. He started passing laws immediately. He banned drinking on Sundays, before 2 p.m. anyway. He banned speeding. Yes, speeding, with wagons. He forced people to attend church. He tried to clean up the streets. He was the original fun police. But, cynically speaking, he was also exactly what the city needed. He paved the streets with cobblestones. He improved the sanitation. He organized a police force, the Rattle Watch, named after the wooden rattles they shook to scare off bad guys. He turned the disorganized trading post into a functioning town. Stuyvesant was also a massive bigot, even for his time. He tried to ban Lutherans, Quakers and Jews from the colony. He wanted a unified Dutch reformed city. But here's the interesting thing. The Dutch West India Company, back in Amsterdam, overruled him. Why? Not because they were champions of human rights, but because they were champions of profit. When Stuyvesant tried to kick out a group of Jewish refugees, the company wrote him a letter saying, essentially, "Stop it. We need the manpower. We need the trade. If they have money and they want to work, let them stay. This is a crucial moment in NYC history. It established the city's DNA. Tolerance is a byproduct of commerce. We don't have to like each other, but if we're going to make money together, we have to tolerate each other. That mercenary pragmatism is the heartbeat of New York. Under Stuyvesant, the city grew. It expanded north. Farms, or Bowery in Dutch, spread out. The road leading to Stuyvesant's own farm became known as the Bowery. The Bowery. Across the river, villages like Breukelen, Brooklyn, and Vlissingen, Flushing were established. The northern wilderness was owned by a guy named Jonas Bronk, but while Stuyvesant was busy fixing the potholes and yelling at drunks, a bigger threat was looming on the horizon: the British. The British and the Dutch were rivals. They fought over trade routes, over colonies, over everything, and the British looked at New Amsterdam, this strategic wedge between their New England colonies in the north and their Virginia colonies in the south, and they wanted it. It was a gap in their coverage. Plus, the harbour was just too good to leave in the hands of the Dutch. King Charles II of England, in a classic move of royal nepotism, decided to give the entire territory to his brother, the Duke of York. There was just one small problem. The Dutch already owned it. The king basically said, "Hey, just go take it." So, in August 1664, 4 English frigates appeared in the harbour. They trained their cannons on the flimsy walls of New Amsterdam. Stuyvesant, stumping around on his peg leg, wanted to fight. He was ready to go down swinging. He tore up the surrender letter sent by the English. He rallied the troops. He went to the ramparts and yelled at the ships. But the citizens of New Amsterdam, they looked at the English warships. They looked at their own crumbling fort. They looked at Stuyvesant, who had been banning their beer and taxing their income for 17 years. And they looked at the terms the English were offering. Keep your property, keep your religion, keep your trade, just change the flag. The prominent merchants of the city, including Stuyvesant's own son, basically said, "Peter, let it go. It's over. We're not dying for the Dutch West India Company." Stuyvesant was furious. He was humiliated, but he was alone. On September 8, 1664, he surrendered the city without a single shot being fired. The English rowed ashore, lowered the Dutch flag, raised the Union Jack, and renamed the place New York. But here is the kicker, and the thing to remember as we move forward. The English took the government, but the Dutch kept the culture. The city didn't suddenly become a polite English tea-drinking town. It stayed rowdy, it stayed commercial, it kept its jagged, multilingual, profit-driven edge. The English had acquired the hardware, but the Dutch software was already installed deep in the system. So the sun sets on New Amsterdam. The pigs are still in the streets, but now they are English subjects. The air is thick with the smoke of wood fires and the salty tang of the harbour. The tavern doors swing open, spilling yellow light onto the muddy cobblestones of Stone Street. Inside, men are speaking Dutch, English, French, and African dialects, making deals, complaining about the taxes, and plotting the next hustle. It didn't matter much to the guy pouring the ale, or the stevedore hauling crates of molasses off the ships at the East River docks. The flag flapping above the fort had changed from the orange, white and blue of the Dutch Republic to the Union Jack, but the mud was just as deep, the winters just as biting, and the hustle just as relentless. The English didn't burn New Amsterdam down, they just rebranded it. It was a hostile takeover, sure, but a smart one. They kept the Dutch merchants in place because those guys knew how to make money, and the Duke of York, the king's brother, and the city's new namesake liked money very much. He never actually visited the city, by the way. He just sat in England collecting the rents. It was the ultimate absentee landlord situation, a tradition New York landlords have proudly upheld for 3.5 centuries. They're English, so New York in the late 1600s and early 1700s began to morph. It was a strange hybrid creature. You walked down the street and heard a pidgin mix of Dutch and English. You saw Dutch-style houses with those stepped gable roofs right next to severe brick English colonial structures. It was an architectural argument happening in real time. But let's zoom in on the streets themselves. The city was still incredibly small. If you lived north of Wall Street, you were basically living in the boonies. The area that is now Tribeca and Soho was farmland, forests and streams. The city was just that tight cluster at the tip of the island. And it was becoming a pressure cooker. Because the English were obsessed with efficiency, they started to organize things. They filled in more of the canals, they expanded the docks, they started the landfill projects that would eventually widen Manhattan significantly. If you're standing on Water Street today, you're standing where the ships used to anchor. Everything east of that is garbage, rubble, and dirt dumped there to create expensive real estate out of thin air/water. But this growth had a dark, heavy underbelly that we cannot gloss over. We have to talk about slavery. It's a common misconception that slavery was a southern thing. In the 1700s, New York City had one of the highest rates of slave ownership in the colonies, second only to Charleston, South Carolina. By 1703, 42% of New York households owned enslaved people. They weren't working on massive cotton plantations. They were woven into the tight urban fabric of the city. They worked as domestic servants, dock workers, carpenters, and blacksmiths. The infrastructure of colonial New York, the roads you'd walk on, the wall that gave Wall Street its name, the fort itself, was built by enslaved African labor. There was a massive market at the foot of Wall Street where human beings were bought and sold right alongside timber and grain. And just outside the city limits, just north of the wall, near present-day City Hall Park, lies the African burial ground. For decades, this was the only place enslaved people could bury their dead. It was forgotten, paved over and ignored, until construction workers found it in the 1998. It's a stark reminder that beneath the concrete, the city is built on bones. The tension in the city was palpable. There were uprisings. In 1712, a group of enslaved men set fire to a building on Maiden Lane and ambushed the white colonists who came to put it out. The retribution was swift and horrifyingly brutal. The city was a powder keg of racial tension, class struggle, and colonial ambition, all packed into a generic square mile of mud. But if the land was tense, the water was lawless. Welcome to the golden age of piracy, New York style. We tend to think of pirates as Caribbean outlaws, hiding in secret coves. But in the 1690s, pirates didn't hide in New York. They went shopping. The city was a pirate haven. The merchants of New York loved pirates. Why? Because pirates brought in luxury goods, silks, spices, gold, and sold them tax-free at a discount, and the pirates, fresh off a raid in the Indian Ocean or the Red Sea, had pockets full of gold coins they were desperate to spend on booze and women. It was a symbiotic relationship. The most famous resident of this era was Captain William Kidd. His residence was in the area of St. Thomas Aquinas. Captain William. Now, pop culture paints Kidd as this bloodthirsty villain. In reality, he was a respectable New Yorker. He lived in a nice house on Wall Street. He helped build Trinity Church. He was a privateer, essentially a legal pirate hired by the government to attack enemy French ships. He was a government contractor with a ship. The problem was, the line between privateer and pirate is very blurry, usually depending on whose ship you rob. Kidd went out, didn't find any French ships, his crew got antsy, and he ended up attacking a ship that technically belonged to a neutral party but was captained by an Englishman. It was a mess, a bureaucratic nightmare on the high seas. When he came back to New York expecting to clear his name with his political connections, he found out the political winds had changed. He had become a liability. He was arrested, shipped to London, and hanged. His body was dipped in tar and hung in a cage over the Thames as a warning. But back in New York, people were likely still wearing the silks he'd brought in, drinking the wine he'd stolen, and looking at his empty house on Wall Street thinking, shame about Bill, great neighbor though. As the 18th century marched on, the city started to feel less like a rough outpost and more like a miniature London. The wealthy merchant class began to solidify. These were the families whose names are still plastered all over the city's street signs, the Livingstons, the Delanceys, the Van Cortlands. They built grand Georgian mansions. They threw tea parties. They imported fine furniture. They were desperate to prove they weren't just colonial bumpkins. But New York has always had a rebellious streak, a dislike for authority that runs deep in the bedrock. And in 1735 that streak put the city on the map for something other than commerce, freedom of the press. The governor at the time was a man named William Cosby. Cosby was the worst kind of politician, greedy, arrogant, and thin-skinned. He was involved in all sorts of shady land deals and riggings. Most of the newspapers in town were just mouthpieces for the government, but there was one small paper, the New York Weekly Journal, printed by a German immigrant named John Peter Zenger. Zenger didn't write the articles, he was just the printer, but the articles were brutal. They called Cosby out for his corruption. They mocked him. They satirized him. Cosby was furious. He ordered the newspapers to be publicly burned, which, cynically, is just great publicity. Then he had Zenger arrested for seditious libel. Now, under the law at the time, libel didn't mean lying. It just meant publishing something that damaged the government's reputation. It didn't matter if it was true. In fact, the legal maxim was, the greater the truth, the greater the libel, because the truth hurts more. Zenger rotted in a jail cell in the basement of City Hall for 8 months, while his wife kept the printing press running. Shout out to Anna Zenger, the unsung hero. When the trial finally came, the judge, who was a crony of the governor, basically told the jury, look, he printed the papers. That's a fact. So, he's guilty. Your job is just to say, guilty. But Zenger's lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, no relation to Alexander, though just as dramatic, pulled a move that would change history. He argued to the jury, how can it be libel if it's true? Freemen have a right to complain when they are hurt. He appealed directly to the jury's conscience, bypassing the judge and the law. He essentially said, Are we going to let this pompous jerk in the governor's mansion tell us what we can read? The jury deliberated for 10 minutes. Not guilty. The courtroom exploded. This was massive. It established the precedent that the truth is an absolute defense against libel. It sowed the seeds for the First Amendment. And it happened right there in Lower Manhattan, because a German printer and a smart lawyer decided to troll the governor. As we move into the 1750s and 60s, the mood in the city begins to darken. The French and Indian War was a global conflict that spilled over into the colonies, and while the fighting was mostly in the wilderness, New York was the supply hub. The British military presence increased. Redcoats were everywhere. And when the war ended, the bill came due. Britain was broke. Wars are expensive. And Parliament looked at the colonies, especially prosperous places like New York, and said, you guys need to pay your share. Enter the taxes, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act. New York hated the Stamp Act. It required that all legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, basically anything paper, had to carry a royal stamp, which you had to pay for. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle. No taxation without representation. The city became a hotbed of resistance. The Sons of Liberty formed. These weren't the polite founding fathers you see in paintings. These were street brawlers. They erected liberty poles in the common City Hall Park. The British soldiers would cut them down. The Sons of Liberty would put them back up. They would grease the poles so the soldiers couldn't climb them. It was a capture-the-lag game with very high stakes. Violence broke out in the streets. This was the Battle of Golden Hill in 1770, actually occurring before the Boston Massacre, where British soldiers and New Yorkers fought with bayonets and clubs in the financial district. First blood of the Revolution, right there near John Street. The city was dividing. You had the patriots, Whigs, who wanted liberty, and the loyalists, Tories, who wanted to stay with the king. And New York, being the center of commerce, had a lot of loyalists. Businessmen hate instability. Revolution is bad for the bottom line. So the city was split down the middle. Neighbors stopped talking to neighbors. It was a civil war before the war even started. Let's set the scene for the calm before the storm. It's early 1776. The city has grown to about 25,000 people. It's still confined to the tip of Manhattan, but it's dense. The streets are paved with cobblestones. Oil lamps flicker on the corners at night. The smell is a mix of the sea, horse manure, and the brewing revolution. At the foot of Broadway, at the Bowling Green, a lovely little oval park, there stands a magnificent statue. It's King George III, sitting on a horse, dressed as a Roman emperor. It's made of lead, and it's painted gold. It glitters in the sun. It is the ultimate symbol of British power, watching over the harbour, ensuring that every ship that comes in pays its duties. The ships coming in now aren't bringing tea, they are bringing troops. General George Washington arrives in the city. He knows New York is the key. If the British take New York, they control the Hudson River. If they control the Hudson, they split the colonies in two, isolating radical New England from the agricultural South. The war will be over. Washington has to hold New York. But he looks at the geography, an island surrounded by navigable rivers, perfect for the massive British Navy, and he looks at his own ragtag army of farmers and shopkeepers, and he knows he is in trouble. He is trying to defend a city that is indefensible without a navy. Tension is unbearable. Every day, people look to the horizon, waiting for the British fleet, and then they appear. It's June 1776. A forest of masts rises in the lower bay. It's the largest expeditionary force Britain has ever sent out. Hundreds of ships, 30,000 troops, Hessian mercenaries. It is a terrifying display of imperial might. Washington watches from Manhattan. He reads the Declaration of Independence to his troops on July 9th at the Common, right where City Hall is today. The soldiers and the crowd get so fired up that they rush down Broadway to the Bowling Green. They swarm the statue of King George III. They throw ropes around it. They pull until the lead bends and snaps. The king comes crashing down. They hack the statue to pieces. They decapitate the figure. And here is the ultimate New York recycling project. They take the lead from the statue, melt it down, and cast it into 42,088 musket balls. They are literally going to shoot the king back at his own soldiers. They are literally going to shoot the king back at his own soldiers. But bravado doesn't win battles. The British land on Staten Island. Then they cross to Brooklyn. The Battle of Brooklyn, or the Battle of Long Island, begins in August 1776. It is the first major battle of the United States as a country, and it is an absolute disaster. The British outflank Washington. They smash through his lines in Brooklyn, around present-day Prospect Park and Greenwood Cemetery. The Americans are routed. They are pinned against the East River, trapped in Brooklyn Heights. If the wind had been different, if the British General Howe had been a little more aggressive, the American Revolution would have ended right there. Washington and his entire army would have been captured. No United States, no president, just a failed rebellion. But nature intervened. A dense fog settled over the East River. A providential fog, they called it later. Under the cover of that fog, and with the help of fishermen from Massachusetts who knew how to row silently, Washington evacuated his entire army, 9,000 men, horses and cannon, across the river to Manhattan in the middle of the night. When the sun rose and the fog lifted, the British charged the American lines in Brooklyn, only to find empty trenches. Washington had ghosted them. But now the war was in Manhattan, and the city was about to burn. So Washington was running. The Continental Army retreated north, up the length of the island, fighting a series of scrappy, losing battles. They fought at Harlem Heights, which was actually a rare win, boosting morale just enough to keep them from quitting, and they fought at White Plains. But eventually, Washington had to leave. He crossed into New Jersey, looking back at the city he had lost. And then the lights went out. Or rather, they went up in flames. On September 21, 1776, just a few days after the British took full control, a fire started in a tavern near Whitehall Slip at the southern tip of Manhattan. It was a windy night. The houses were wood, the roofs were cedar shingles. It was a recipe for disaster. The fire moved like a living thing. It swept up the west side of the island, consuming everything in its path. It burned with such intensity that people in New Jersey said the sky glowed red. It jumped streets. It chewed through the dense commercial district. Trinity Church, that symbol of Anglican power on Broadway, it didn't stand a chance. The fire caught the roof, and the great steeple, which had been the tallest structure in the city, collapsed into a pyramid of burning timber. The heat was so intense it melted the church bells. By the time the wind died down and the bucket brigades, which were disorganized because the city was in chaos, managed to stop it. A quarter of New York City was gone. 500 buildings were reduced to ash. Now the big historical whodunit. Who set the fire? The British blamed the American rebels, claiming they found incendiary devices hidden in houses. They even executed a few people on the spot, throwing them into the flames. The Americans blamed the British, or just bad luck. Washington, watching from afar, wrote that while he didn't order it, Providence, a god, seemed to be on their side by ruining the prize the British had just captured. To this day, nobody knows for sure. But here is the cynical reality. It didn't matter who started it. The result was that for the next 7 years of British occupation, New York was a half-ruined city. The burnt district wasn't rebuilt, it became a tent city, a shantytown known as Canvas Town. Imagine the misery. You have the British officers living in the nice, surviving mansions, throwing parties and putting on plays, and just a few blocks away, in the charred skeleton of the city, you have the poor, the refugees and the camp followers, living under sailcloth tents amidst the rubble, freezing in the winter and roasting in the summer. New York during the war was a bizarre place. It was the British headquarters in America. It was a garrison town. The population fluctuated wildly. Loyalists from all over the colonies fled to New York for protection. If you were a guy in New Jersey who loved the king and your neighbors were threatening to tar and feather you, you packed your bags and went to Manhattan. The city was under martial law. There was no mayor, just a military commandant. The soldiers were quartered in private homes. If a redcoat knocked on your door and said, "I'm sleeping in your spare room," you said, "Yes, sir, here's the pillow." But the darkest stain of the occupation, and something that haunts the geography of the city to this day, was the prison ships. The British took thousands of American prisoners, soldiers, sailors, privateers. They didn't know what to do with them. They filled the jails, they filled the sugar refineries. The massive Livingston Sugar House on Liberty Street became a house of horrors, and when those were full, they used decommissioned warships. They anchored these rotting hulks in Wallabout Bay, which is now the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The most infamous was the HMS Jersey, nicknamed Hell. These ships were floating coffins. Thousands of men were crammed below decks in total darkness, with no ventilation. Disease ran rampant: smallpox, dysentery, yellow fever. The food was mouldy bread and meat that was more maggot than cow. Every morning the guards would yell down the hatch, "Rebels, bring out your dead." It is estimated that 11,000 Americans died on those ships. That is more than died in all the battles of the Revolutionary War combined. They were thrown into shallow graves on the Brooklyn mudflats. For decades after the war, skulls and femurs would wash up on the shore of the East River. It was a grim, open secret that the city was sitting next to a mass grave. While the prisoners were dying in Brooklyn, the spy game was heating up in Manhattan. Washington needed intel. He needed to know what the British were planning. His first attempt at a spy was a young schoolteacher named Nathan Hale. Bless his heart, Hale was brave, but he was a terrible spy. He had no cover story, no training, and he carried incriminating papers in his shoe. He was caught almost immediately and hanged at the corner of 66th and 3rd Avenue, roughly. His famous last words, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country," are legendary, but from an espionage perspective, the mission was a total bust. So Washington got smarter. He formed the Culper Ring. This was real spycraft, invisible ink, codes, dead drops. The ring operated out of Setauket, Long Island, but their key agent, Robert Townsend, codename Culper Jr., operated a coffee shop and dry goods store in Manhattan. He was a society reporter. He hung out with British officers, listened to their gossip, wrote it down in code, and smuggled the messages out to Long Island, where they were rowed across the Sound to Connecticut and ridden to Washington. Runtur lived part of the time in Connecticut, and ridden to Washington. They were incredibly effective. They uncovered counterfeit money plots. They stopped ambushes. They even helped expose Benedict Arnold's treason, and the British never caught them. Townsend lived the rest of his life in obscurity, and his identity wasn't even discovered by historians until the 20th century. That is how you do covert ops. Finally, after Yorktown, the war ended. But the British didn't leave immediately. It took 2 years to negotiate the peace and organize the evacuation. November the 25, 1783. Evacuation Day. For over a century this was a bigger holiday in New York than the 4th of July. The British troops marched down the Bowery to the docks at the Battery to get on their ships. The American troops, led by Washington, marched in behind them. The city was hysterical with relief, but the British had one last screw-you left in the tank. At the Battery, they had left the Union Jack flying on the flagpole, but before they left, they greased the pole with tallow and knocked off the cleats used to climb it. They wanted the Americans to have to stare at the British flag while the fleet sailed away. It was petty, it was childish, it was perfect. An American sailor named John Van Arsdale bought some cleats, nailed them into the slippery wood, climbed up, ripped down the British flag, and raised the Stars and Stripes. The cannons fired a salute. The crowd went wild. The British fleet disappeared over the horizon. New York was American. Washington didn't stay long. He had a very emotional farewell dinner with his officers at Francis Tavern on Pearl Street. You can still go there. It's a museum and a bar. It smells like beer and history. He raised a glass of wine and said, "With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you." Huge, tough generals were weeping openly. Washington hugged them, walked out the door, got on a barge, and went home to Virginia to retire, or so he thought. New York City was now free, but it was a wreck. Half of it was still burnt. The trees were gone, cut down for firewood by the British. The population had plummeted to 12,000. It was a ghost town with a harbour. But New York recovers faster than any place on earth. The Loyalists left 30,000 of them, took ships to Canada or the Caribbean, and the Patriots came back, and with them came the merchant. The city rebuilt with a frenzy. They filled in the rest of the slips, they paved more streets, and in 1785 New York City became the capital of the United States under the Articles of Confederation. For 5 years, New York was the DC of the young nation. Congress met at City Hall on Wall Street. Foreign ambassadors lived on Broadway. It was the center of everything. But the government was broken. The Articles of Confederation were too weak. They couldn't tax. They couldn't pay the war debt. The country was falling apart. So they wrote the Constitution, and after a lot of arguing, mostly in the newspapers, specifically the Federalist papers written largely by New Yorkers, Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, the Constitution was ratified. And who would be the first president? The guy who just wanted to farm in Virginia. April 30, 1789. The first presidential inauguration. It happened right here, on the balcony of Federal Hall on Wall Street. Picture the scene. The streets are packed. People are hanging out of windows. Washington steps out onto the balcony, wearing a brown suit made of American cloth, a strategic fashion choice to support domestic industry. He places his hand on a Bible. He takes the oath. The crowd cheers, "Long live George Washington, President of the United States." It was a massive party, fireworks, illuminations. But think about the irony. The ceremony took place on Wall Street. The very first act of the federal government happened in the financial district. This cemented the bond between the American government and American finance. They were born in the same room. Washington lived in a house on Cherry Street, which is now basically under the Brooklyn Bridge ramp. He found New York expensive. Some things never change. He complained about the rent. He complained that he couldn't find a good cook. His Treasury Secretary, however, was right at home. Alexander Hamilton. We have to talk about Hamilton. He is the patron saint of New York. He was an immigrant, illegitimate, brilliant, abrasive, and a workaholic. He looked at the United States, which was basically a collection of farmers in debt, and he envisioned a commercial superpower. He wanted a central bank. He wanted a stock market. He wanted manufacturing, and he wanted it all centered in New York. His rival was Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson hated cities. He thought they were sores on the body politic. He wanted America to be a pastoral utopia of yeoman farmers. He looked at New York with its speculators, its noise, its loose morals, and he saw hell. Hamilton looked at New York and saw the future. The deal was made at a dinner party on Maiden Lane, the famous room where it happened. Jefferson and Madison agreed to let Hamilton assume the state debts, which enriched the bankers in New York, and in exchange Hamilton agreed to move the capital south to a swamp on the Potomac. New York lost the capital in 1790. It moved to Philadelphia for 10 years, then to D.C. New Yorkers were annoyed, but they got the better end of the deal. They lost the politicians, but they kept the money. And speaking of money, let's look at a very specific tree. In 1792, the financial speculation in the city was getting out of hand. People were buying and selling bonds on the street corners like scalpers at a Knicks game. It was chaotic. So 24 stockbrokers got together under a buttonwood tree, a sycamore, outside 68 Wall Street. They signed an agreement, the Buttonwood Agreement. It was simple. We will only trade with each other, and we will charge a standard commission. That was the birth of the New York Stock Exchange. That tree is the ancestor of the closing bell, the trading floor, the screens flashing green and red, and the trillions of dollars that flowed through the fiber optic cables under Lower Manhattan today. It started with 24 guys under a tree trying to corner the market on government bonds. As the 18th century came to a close, the city was exploding northwards. They leveled the hills, they filled the ponds. Specifically, there was a pond called the Collect Pond. This is a tragedy of urban planning. The Collect Pond, located near where the courthouses are today on Center Street, was a beautiful, deep, freshwater lake. It was the city's main water source. In the summer, people had picnics there. In the winter, they ice skated. It was idyllic. But the tanneries moved in. Tanneries are factories that turn animal hide into leather. The process involves soaking skins in urine, lime, and dog manure. It is incredibly toxic and smelly. They dumped their runoff into the collect pond. Within a few years, the beautiful lake was a green, bubbling cauldron of poison. It smelled so bad you could taste it. So what did the city do? Did they clean it up? No. They drained it, filled it with garbage and dirt, and built houses on top of it. Bad idea. As the garbage settled, the houses sank. The ground remained damp and foul. The neighborhood built on top of this filled-in swamp became known as the 5 Point. We'll get to the 5 Points properly in a bit, but just know that by burying its problems, New York was creating the most notorious slum in the Western world. The year is 1800. The city has 60,000 people. It is now the largest city in the country, surpassing Philadelphia. The grid hasn't been laid out yet, so the streets north of Houston are still a tangle of country lanes. But the defining conflict of this era, and the end of the founding father generation in New York, was the duel. It's July 1804. Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, these two men had been circling each other for decades in the tight social circles of Manhattan. They were both lawyers, they both lived downtown, they both had political ambitions, and they hated each other. And then, Burr was the Vice President of the United States at the time. Let that sink in. The sitting Vice President shot the former Treasury Secretary. They rowed across the Hudson to Weehawken, New Jersey, because dueling was illegal in New York, though the enforcement was lax. They stood 10 paces apart, on a rocky ledge overlooking the skyline of the city they both helped build. Hamilton fired high, maybe missing on purpose, maybe just a bad shot. Burr fired to kill. Hamilton was rowed back to Manhattan, paralyzed and bleeding. He died the next day at a friend's house in the village. He is buried in Trinity Churchyard, right in the middle of the financial district he created. You can visit him. He's usually surrounded by tourists who have seen the musical. Burr survived, but his life was ruined. He became a pariah. He fled to the south, got involved in a weird plot to start his own country, and eventually returned to New York years later to die in obscurity on Staten Island. With Hamilton gone, the federal era ends. The polite-ish society of the 18th century is over. The 19th century is knocking on the door, and it is bringing steam engines, immigrants, corruption, and a plan to chop the island into little rectangular pieces. The city is about to become a machine. Hamilton was barely cold in the ground before the city developers looked at the chaotic, winding cowpaths of lower Manhattan, looked at the pristine, rolling hills of the north, and said, "You know what this island needs? An Excel spreadsheet." The year was 1811. The city government appointed a commission to figure out how to lay out the streets for the future expansion of New York. The head of this commission was Gouverneur Morris, a founding father who is mostly famous for having a wooden leg and dying after sticking a whalebone up his own urinary tract to clear a blockage. History is gross, folks. Morris and his team didn't care about aesthetics. They didn't care about preserving the hills or the streams or the natural beauty. They certainly didn't care about boulevards or plazas like they had in Europe or DC. They cared about real estate. They explicitly wrote in their report that straight-sided and right-angled houses are the most cheap to build, and the most convenient to live in. So they took a ruler and drew a grid over the entire island. 12 avenues running north-south, 155 streets running east-west. It was ruthless geometry. It ignored the topography completely. If there was a hill, flatten it. If there was a stream, bury it. If there was a boulder, blow it up. This is the Commissioner's Plan of 1811. It is the defining feature of New York. It turned the land into a commodity. You could buy a lot on 45th Street and 5th Avenue 30 years before there was even a road there, because you knew exactly where it would be. It was the democratization of land speculation. The only exception to this rigid grid was Broadway. Broadway was the old Lenape Trail, the Wickersgeck Road, and it refused to be straightened. It slices diagonally across the grid like a rebellious scar, creating all those weird bow-tie intersections, Times Square, Union Square, Herald Square, that confuse tourists and create traffic nightmares to this day. While the surveyors were busy hammering stakes into the ground in the middle of nowhere, which is now Midtown, the United States decided to get into another scrap with Great Britain, the War of 1812. New York was terrified. They remembered the occupation, they remembered the prison ships. They thought the British fleet was going to come back and burn the place down again. So they fortified. They built forts everywhere. They built Fort Gibson on Ellis Island. They built Fort Wood on Bedloe's Island, which is the star-shaped base the Statue of Liberty stands on today. And right at the tip of Manhattan, on a little artificial island made of rocks, they built the West Battery, later known as Castle Clinton. The British never showed up. The war was mostly fought on the Canadian border and in DC, which actually did get burned. So New York ended the war with a bunch of brand new unused forts. Castle Clinton eventually became an opera house, then an immigration station, then an aquarium, and now it's where you buy tickets to see the Statue of Liberty. It's the ultimate architectural survivor. But the real game changer wasn't the war, it was a ditch. DeWitt Clinton, the nephew of the guy the forts were named after and the mayor of New York, and later governor, had a crazy idea. He wanted to build a canal from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. People laughed at him. They called it Clinton's Folly, or Clinton's Big Ditch. It was an engineering nightmare. 363 miles through the wilderness of upstate New York, hand-dug by Irish immigrants who were dying of malaria in the swamps near Syracuse. It cost a fortune, but Clinton was right. Before the canal, if you wanted to move a ton of wheat from Buffalo to New York City, it cost $100, 0 cents, and took 3 weeks over muddy, rutted roads. After the canal opened, the cost dropped to $6, 0 cents, and took 8 days. In 1825, the canal was finished. The celebration was arguably the biggest party New York had ever seen. Clinton sailed down the canal on a boat called the Seneca Chief, collecting buckets of water from Lake Erie. A flotilla of ships met him in the harbor. He poured the fresh water of the Great Lakes into the salt water of the Atlantic Ocean, the wedding of the waters. This was the moment New York won. It was over. Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, they were finished as competitors. New York was now the funnel for the entire North American continent. The raw materials of the Midwest flowed east to New York, and the manufactured goods of Europe flowed west through New York. The city became the middleman for the world, and the money, oh, the money rained down. The harbor became a forest of masts. South Street was known as the Street of Ships. The bowsprits of the clippers stretched out over the street, so you could walk under a canopy of rigging. The smell was intoxicating. Tea from China, coffee from Brazil, sugar from the Caribbean, and the ubiquitous smell of tar and horse manure. Counting houses lined the streets. This is when the merchant prince era began. Men like John Jacob Astor became incomprehensibly rich. Astor, a German immigrant who started as a butcher, made his first fortune in furs and his second in real estate. He bought up land in Manhattan when it was cheap, waited for the grid to arrive, and leased it out. He famously said on his deathbed, "Could I begin life again, knowing what I now know, and had money to invest, I would buy every foot of land on the island of Man." Astor was the prototype for the New York billionaire, ruthless, unsentimental, and obsessed with the long game. But while the Astors were building mansions, the city was getting crowded, and dirty, and dangerous. By the 1830s, the population had swelled to over 200,000. The infrastructure couldn't handle it. There was no sewage system. People threw their night soil, chamber pot contents, into the gutters or into cesspools in their backyard. The water from the wells was contaminated by the cesspools. The result, cholera. The cholera epidemic of 1832 was a horror movie. It killed 3,500 people in a few months. The wealthy fled to the countryside, Greenwich Village and Chelsea, which is why those neighborhoods developed rapidly during this time. The poor were left to die in the slums, and the worst slum of them all was the 5 Points. Remember the Collect Pond, the poisoned lake they filled in? Well, the ground settled, the houses sank, and the rents dropped. It became the destination for the poorest of the poorest of the poor freed African Americans and the newly arriving Irish immigrants. The intersection of 5 streets, Anthony, Orange and Cross streets, intersected, became the 5 Point. It was the most notorious neighborhood in the world. Charles Dickens visited in 1842 and was horrified. He wrote about lanes and alleys paved with mud knee-deep, and hideous tenements which take their name from robbery and murder. The centerpiece of the 5 Points was the old brewery. It was exactly what it sounds like, a dilapidated brewery turned into a tenement. It housed over 1,000 people. It was a labyrinth of dark corridors and windowless rooms. There were rumors of Murderer's Alley inside the building, where police refused to go. But the 5 Points wasn't just a hellhole, it was also a melting pot. It was one of the few places where black and white people lived together, drank together, and danced together. Tap dancing was arguably invented there, a fusion of Irish step dancing and African shuffle. It was a place of vibrant, desperate culture. And then the city burned. Again. December 16th, 1835. It was one of the coldest nights on record. The temperature was 17 degrees below zero. The East River was frozen solid. A fire broke out in a warehouse on Merchant Street. The volunteer fire department rushed to the scene. These fire companies were more like social clubs or gangs than professional first responders. They wore fancy uniforms and fought each other for the privilege of putting out fires. But on this night, they were helpless. The hydrants were frozen. They drilled holes in the ice of the East River to suck up water, but the wind blew the spray back onto the firefighters, coating them in ice. The water froze in the hoses. The fire raged for 2 days. It destroyed the entire financial district, Wall Street, the Merchants Exchange, hundreds of warehouses filled with silk, tea and chemicals. The loss was equivalent to billions of dollars today. But here is the resilience of New York. The smoke was still rising when the merchants started setting up desks made of planks and barrels to resume trading. They didn't mourn, they rebuilt, and they rebuilt better. No more wood. The new financial district was built of granite and sandstone. It was built to look like a fortress of capitalism. The fire made one thing very clear. The city needed water, reliable, pressurized water. The solution was the Croton Aqueduct. This was a Roman-level engineering feat. They dammed the Croton River in Westchester, 41 miles north of the city. They built a masonry tunnel that maintained a consistent slope of 13 inches per mile, using gravity alone to bring the water to Manhattan. It crossed the Harlem River on the High Bridge, which is still there, you can walk on it. It flowed into receiving reservoirs in what is now Central Park, and then into a massive distribution reservoir at 42nd Street and 5th Avenue. That reservoir was a landmark. It looked like an Egyptian temple. It had massive sloping walls 50 feet high. It was a place where people would promenade on Sundays. It stood there until the 1890s, when they tore it down to build the New York Public Library. If you go to the library today, you can still see parts of the reservoir's foundation in the lower levels. On October 14, 1842, the water was turned on. A fountain in City Hall Park shot a jet of crystal clear water 50 feet into the air. People wept. They drank it. They bathed in it. For the first time, New York City had clean water. It was the beginning of modern public health. But just as the water arrived to clean the streets, a new wave of humanity arrived to fill them. The Irish potato famine began in 1845. The blight turned the potatoes black and mushy in the ground. 1 million people died in Ireland. 1 million more fled. They came to New York on coffin ships. These vessels were overcrowded, disease-ridden, and barely seaworthy. When the immigrants arrived at the South Street Seaport or the quarantine station on Staten Island, they were half dead, starving, and destitute. They didn't have money to move west. They stuck where they landed. They flooded into the Five Points. They flooded into the shanties along the waterfront. By 1855, over a quarter of New York City's population was Irish-born. The native-born New Yorkers, the nativists, or know-nothings, were not welcoming. They saw the Irish as drunkards, criminals, and tools of the Pope. No Irish need apply signs appeared in windows. The tension was tribal. You had the Protestant establishment, the old Dutch and English families controlling the money, and you had the Catholic Irish controlling the streets. This is where the gang culture of New York really takes root. You had the Dead Rabbits, Irish, the Bowery Boys, nativist, the Roach Guards. They fought pitched battles in the streets with brickbats, clubs and knives. This wasn't West Side Story with choreographed dancing. This was brutal, bloody, territorial warfare. Politics became a contact sport. The democratic political machine, Tammany Hall, saw an opportunity. They realized that if they helped the Irish, gave them a turkey at Christmas, some coal in the winter, a job on the docks, the Irish would vote for them. And so the machine was built. Tammany Hall became the gateway for the immigrant poor. It was corrupt, yes. They stole millions, but to the guy starving in a tenement, the Tammany ward boss was the only person who actually cared if he lived or died. It was a transactional form of welfare that would dominate the city for a century. In the midst of this chaos, the city kept pushing north. The wealthy moved to Union Square, then Gramercy Park. They built brownstones, rows of identical houses, faced with Triassic sandstone, quarried in Connecticut. The brownstone became the uniform of the New York bourgeoisie, and amidst the grime, a few visionaries started to realize that the grid was too perfect. There was no breathing room. The city was a machine for commerce, but it was becoming unlivable for humans. A poet and newspaper editor named William Cullen Bryant started campaigning for a great park. He argued that the city needed lungs. He was joined by landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux. They looked at the rocky, swampy, undesirable land in the center of the island land that was currently occupied by pig farms, bone-boiling plants, and a thriving African-American community called Seneca Village. Seneca Village is another one of those ghosts beneath the grid. It was a stable, property-owning black community between 82nd and 89th Streets. They had churches, a school, and gardens. Is a refuge from the racism of downtown. But the city wanted a park, and in New York, when the city wants your land, you lose your land. In 1857, the city used eminent domain to evict the residents of Seneca Village. They razed the houses, they kicked out the residents, and Olmsted and Vaux began the massive project of constructing Central Park. It was an artificial landscape. Every tree, every rock, every pond in Central Park was placed there by design, was a theatrical set designed to look like nature. They moved more earth to build Central Park than they did to build the fortifications during the Revolutionary War. So as we approach the 1860s, look at the contrast. You have the serene, man-made paradise of Central Park being built uptown. You have the marble palaces of the new department stores, like A.T. Stewart's Marble Palace on Broadway. And downtown, you have the festering, boiling rage of the slums, where the Irish and the free blacks are fighting for scraps, watched over by the corrupt eyes of Tammany Hall. The city is a pressure cooker. The lid is rattling, the steam is escaping, and down south, the country is tearing itself apart over the issue of slavery. New York is conflicted. The city's merchants rely on southern cotton. They bankroll the plantation owners. The mayor, Fernando Wood, will actually suggest that New York City secede from the Union, along with the South, to become a free city-state called Triinsular. That's how tied to the South New York was. It was a copperhead city, a city of Southern sympathizers in the North. When the Civil War finally breaks, New York will explode, not on the battlefield, but in the streets. The worst riot in American history is just around the corner. It was a strange, schizophrenic time. While the rest of the North was rallying around the Union flag, New York City felt like a moody teenager refusing to come out of its room. The city's economy was addicted to the South. Southern cotton fed the northern textile mills, but New York's banks financed the whole operation. Shipping cotton was the city's side hustle, and it paid very, very well. So when the Civil War kicked off in 1861, New York didn't cheer, it panicked. The stock market crashed. Merchants, terrified of losing their southern debts, threw up their hands. But then, the cynical pragmatism of the city kicked in. The government in Washington started handing out contracts, uniforms, rifles, munitions, bread, ships. Suddenly the factories in New York were humming. The Brooks Brothers, yes, that Brooks Brothers, were churning out uniforms for the Union Army, though Scandalously, they used shoddy, a recycled wool that fell apart in the rain. It was the first of many wartime grifts. The war became a gold rush. But only for some, for the Irish emigrants living in the Five Points and the shanties along the rivers. The war was a disaster. Inflation skyrocketed, the price of food doubled, wages didn't budge, and then came the final insult, the Conscription Act of 1863, the draft. The law said every male citizen between 20 and 45 had to register, but there was a loophole, a commutation fee. If you were drafted, you could pay $300, 0 cents, which is about $6,000, 0 cents today, roughly a year's wages for a labourer, and get out of it. Or you could hire a substitute to go die in your place. The message was clear. It was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Monday, July 13th, 1863. It was hot. That oppressive, thick, swampy New York heat that makes your clothes stick to your skin. The draft lottery was scheduled to begin at the Provost Marshal's office on 3rd Avenue and 47th Street. At first, it was just a protest. Firemen from the Black Joke Engine Company, No. 33, great name, tough guys, showed up, but then a cobblestone went through a window, then another, then the building was on fire. The mob exploded. This wasn't a protest anymore. It was an insurrection. For 4 days, New York City was a war zone. The police were overwhelmed. The mob cut the telegraph wires, effectively blinding the authorities. They tore up railroad tracks. They stormed the Bull's Head Hotel because the owner refused to serve them liquor. They burned the mayor's house. But the rage, initially directed at the wealthy and the government, quickly and tragically shifted targets. The mob turned on the city's black population. They blamed them for the war. They blamed them for the potential competition for jobs. The violence was unspeakable. They lynched men from lampposts on Clarkson Street. They hunted people through the alleyways. The absolute nadir of humanity happened on 5th Avenue between 43rd and 44th Streets, where the mob attacked the Colored Orphan Asylum. Inside were over 200 children. The mob broke down the doors. They looted the bedding. They set the building on fire. Miraculously, the staff managed to sneak the children out the back door just minutes before the building collapsed. It took the Union Army fresh from the slaughter at Gettysburg marching into the city to stop it. Soldiers fired cannons into the crowds on 2nd Avenue. Bayonets cleared the street. When the smoke cleared, over 100 people were dead. Some estimates say closer to 1,000. Millions of dollars in property were destroyed. It remains the deadliest civil unrest in American history. And it changed the demographics of the city instantly. Thousands of black New Yorkers fled the city, moving to Brooklyn or New Jersey to escape the terror. The black population of Manhattan plummeted and wouldn't recover for decades. The city licked its wounds, buried the dead, and went right back to making money. The post-war era ushered in the Gilded Age. Mark Twain coined the term, and it's perfect. Gilded means covered in a thin layer of gold leaf to hide the cheap metal underneath. That was New York in the 1870s. The rich got richer. The old money, the Knickerbockers, was suddenly being outspent by the new money, the industrialists, the Vanderbilts, the Morgans, the Carnegies. They built mansions on 5th Avenue that looked like French chateaus. They threw parties where they gave guests diamond necklaces as party favors. But who was actually running the city? Enter William M. Tweed, Boss Tweed. Tweed is the gold standard for political corruption. He was a big man, over 300 pounds, with a bald head and a diamond stickpin in his shirt that was practically a lighthouse beam. He wasn't the mayor. He was the head of Tammany Hall, the democratic machine. Tweed and his ring controlled everything. The courts, the police, the legislature, the contracts. If you wanted to sell a chair to the city, you talked to Tweed. The masterpiece of his grift was the New York County Courthouse, now the Tweed Courthouse behind City Hall. It was supposed to cost $250,000, 0 cents. By the time they were done, or rather stopped, it had cost $13 million, 0 cents. That's more than the US paid for Alaska, the hour. Accounting magic. A carpenter was paid $360,000, 0 cents, for 1 month's work. A plasterer was paid $133,000, 0 cents, for 2 days of work. Of course, the carpenter and the plasterer didn't keep that money. They kicked most of it back to Tweed. They bought $179,000, 0 cents worth of chairs. Tweed was untouchable. He famously said, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" The answer came from a cartoonist. Thomas Nast, drawing for Harper's Weekly, started depicting Tweed as a bloated, greedy giant with a money bag for a head. Tweed hated it. He reportedly screamed, "I don't care a straw for your newspaper articles. My constituents don't know how to read, but they can't help seeing them damned pictures." The pictures worked. The public outrage grew. Tweed was eventually arrested, sued, and thrown in jail. In a final twist of irony, he escaped, fled to Spain, and was recognized by a Spanish police officer who identified him because he had seen a Thomas Nast cartoon. He died in the Ludlow Street jail, a prison he had helped build, and likely overcharged for. While Tweed was stealing the city's money, a German immigrant named John Augustus Roebling was staring at the East River and dreaming of a miracle. Brooklyn and New York were still separate cities. In fact, Brooklyn was the third largest city in America. The only way to cross the turbulent, fast-moving East River was by ferry. And in the winter, when the river froze, the commute was a nightmare. Roebling proposed a suspension bridge, but not just a bridge, a monster. It would be the longest suspension bridge in the world by far. It would be built of steel, which was a new, unproven material for bridges. It would have Gothic towers, taller than anything in the New York skyline, except Trinity Church. People thought he was crazy. They said the wind would blow it down. They said the span was too long, but Roebling was a genius. He designed a web of steel cables that made the bridge 6 times stronger than it needed to be. He was ready to start. Then a ferry crushed his foot. He was standing on a pier, surveying the location for the tower, and a ferry boat bumped the piling. His toes were crushed. He developed tennis lockjaw. He died a slow, agonizing death, just as construction was beginning. His son, Washington Roebling, took over. He was young, a Civil War hero, and brilliant. But the river demanded a sacrifice from him too. To build the towers, they had to dig down to the bedrock at the bottom of the river. They used caissons. Imagine a massive bottomless wooden box the size of a tennis court. You sink it into the river, you pump it full of compressed air to keep the water out. Men go down inside the box, onto the riverbed, and dig out the mud. As they dig, the box sinks. It was hell on earth. Inside the caisson, the air pressure was intense. Voices sounded squeaky. candles burned super fast. It was hot and humid, and when the men came back up to the surface too quickly, they got the bends. Paralysis, and some died. Washington Roebling went down into the caissons constantly to supervise. He got the bends bad. It crippled him. He became an invalid, unable to leave his bedroom in Brooklyn Heights. So, who built the bridge? His wife, Emily Roebling. This is one of the great untold stories, until recently. Emily Roebling took over. She learned higher mathematics. She learned strength of materials. She learned cable specifications. For 11 years she was the liaison between her bedridden husband and the engineers on site. But she wasn't just a messenger. She was managing the project. The workers respected her. She dealt with the politicians. She dealt with the suppliers. When the bridge finally opened in 1883, Emily Roebling was the first person to cross it, carrying a rooster, a symbol of victory. The opening was pandemonium. President Chester A. Arthur was there. Fireworks, cannon fire. It was the eighth wonder of the world. It connected the two great cities, paving the way for the consolidation that would happen later. It was a cathedral of stone and steel, a testament to the fact that New York could conquer nature. But tragically, a week after it opened, a woman tripped on the stairs. Someone screamed. The crowd panicked, thinking the bridge was collapsing. In the stampede, 12 people were crushed to death. It was a grim reminder of the city's nervous energy. To prove the bridge was safe, P.T. Barnum later marched 21 elephants, including the famous Jumbo, across the span. The bridge didn't budge. While the bridge was stretching east, the city was stretching up. For most of history, buildings were limited to about 5 or 6 stories. Why? Because people have legs. Nobody wants to walk up 6 flights of stairs. The top floors were the cheapest, the garrets where the poor artists and servants lived. The rich lived on the second floor, the piano nobile. Then came Elisha Otis. In 1853, at the Crystal Palace exhibition, where Bryant Park is now, Otis stood on a platform hoisted high in the air. He had his assistant cut the rope holding the platform. The crowd gasped, expecting him to plummet to his death. But the platform dropped a few inches and stopped. Click. "I am safe, gentlemen," he said. He hadn't invented the elevator. He had invented the safety brake. Before this, if the rope snapped, you died. Now, you were safe. This changed everything. Suddenly, you could build 10, 20, 50 stories high. And the real estate economics flipped. The top floors, away from the noise and the smell of the street, with the best views, became the most expensive. The penthouse was born. The skyline began to spike. The Tribune Building, the Western Union Building. They were the first skyscrapers. They were clumsy looking, heavy masonry buildings. But they were reaching for the clouds. And down on the street, the light was changing. In 1882, Thomas Edison flipped a switch at his Pearl Street station. It was the first central power plant in the United States. Before this, the city was lit by gas. Gaslight is flickering, yellow, and smells like rotten eggs. It sucks the oxygen out of the room. It leaves soot on the walls. Edison's electric light was steady, clean and bright. At first, it was just a square mile in lower Manhattan, mostly Wall Street and the newspaper. Edison knew who to please, but the Great White Way was coming. The city that never sleeps was about to get the technology to stay awake forever. But let's step away from the technological marvels for a second and look at the people. 1880 as saw the beginning of a massive shift in immigration. The Irish and Germans were now the old immigrants. They were running the cops, the fire department, and the saloons. Now the ships were bringing people from southern and eastern Europe, Italians, Russians, Poles, Hungarians, Jews fleeing pogroms, peasants fleeing poverty. They didn't speak English, they looked different, they worshipped differently, and they were crammed into the Lower East Side. If you think your apartment is small, let me introduce you to the dumbbell tenement. Designed in 1879 as a reform to improve housing, the dumbbell tenement, named for its shape, narrow in the middle to create an air shaft, was a disaster. The air shaft was usually filled with garbage and diapers. It acted as a chimney during fires, spreading flames from floor to floor. Inside, entire families, plus boarders, lived in 2 tiny rooms. No sunlight, no privacy. 1 toilet in the hall for 4 families. The density was insane. The Lower East Side in the late 19th century was the most densely populated place on Earth. More dense than Bombay, more dense than Calcutta. It was a hive of humanity. The streets were an open-air market. Pushcarts selling pickles, suspenders, fish, eyeglasses, old coats. The noise was a cacophony of Yiddish, Italian and broken English. But it wasn't just misery. It was energy. It was the incubator of American culture. In the Jewish quarter you had the Yiddish theatre, radical politics and the garment industry. Everyone sewed, the schmatter trade. They were making the clothes for the rest of the country. In Little Italy, around Mulberry Street, you had the feast of San Gennaro, the scent of roasting peppers, and the organ grinders. These neighborhoods were worlds unto themselves. You could live your whole life on Orchard Street and never speak a word of English. And watching all of this was the lady in the harbor, the Statue of Liberty, a gift from France, a giant copper puzzle that arrived in crates. New York in typical fashion was kind of rude about it. We didn't want to pay for the pedestal. The government said no, the rich tycoons said no. So Joseph Pulitzer, the owner of the newspaper The World and a Hungarian immigrant himself, started a crowdfunding campaign. He printed the name of every person who donated, even if it was just a penny. Jane, a servant girl, 50 cents. A lonely newsboy, 10 cents. It worked. The people built the pedestal. In 1886 she was unveiled. Grover Cleveland dedicated her. There was a massive ticker tape parade, the first one actually, where office boys spontaneously threw the ticker tape ribbon out the windows. She stood there, facing out to sea. Not facing the city, facing the arrivals. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Emma Lazarus wrote those words. She was a Sephardic Jewish New Yorker. She understood that the statue wasn't a warrior, she was a mother of exiles. But as the 19th century winds down, the city is about to face its biggest administrative change ever. Manhattan is getting full. Brooklyn is huge. The Bronx is growing. Queens and Staten Island are watching from the sidelines. There is a movement growing, a movement to consolidate, to take these 5 distinct, arguing, competing areas and merge them into one colossal super city. The city of Greater New York is on the ballot. And Brooklyn is not happy about it. They call it the Great Mistake. The year is 1898. If you're a history nerd or a New Yorker with a very specific axe to grind, you know this date. It's the moment New York went from being a big city to being a behemoth. The consolidation of Greater New York sounds like a boring municipal merger, but it was actually a shotgun wedding. The advocates for consolidation, mostly Manhattan politicians and real estate developers, argued that a unified city would be more efficient, powerful, and wealthy. They envisioned a metropolis that could rival London as the capital of the world. But Brooklyn was doing just fine, thank you very much. It was the city of churches, a proud, independent city with its own distinct identity. The people of Brooklyn looked across the river at the corruption of Tammany Hall, the chaos of the slums, and the arrogant swagger of Manhattan, and they said, "Hard pass." The vote was incredibly close. In Brooklyn it passed by a razor-thin margin, less than 300 votes. Many Brooklynites firmly believed the election was rigged by Manhattan operatives. They called it the Great Mistake of 1898, a grudge some old-timers in Cobble Hill still hold on to. But the deed was done. On January 1, 1898, at the stroke of midnight, the borders dissolved. Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, and Staten Island became the 5 boroughs of New York City. The new city was staggering in scale. It covered 300 square miles. It had a population of 3.4 million people instantly. It was the second largest city in the world. But connecting this sprawling archipelago was going to require more than just a bridge. It needed a nervous system. It needed the subway. Now, New York wasn't the first to build a subway. London had done it decades earlier with steam trains, which was hellishly smoky. Boston even beat New York by a few years. But New York, true to form, decided that if it was going to be late to the party, it would bring the best champagne. The first line, the IRT, Interborough Rapid Transit, was built using cut and cover. This means they literally ripped open the streets, dug a massive trench, laid the tracks, built the tunnel, and then covered it back up. Imagine the disruption. For years, major avenues were open wounds, but the speed of construction was insane by modern standards. They built the entire first line from City Hall to 145th Street in just 4 years. October 27th, 1904, opening day. Mayor George McClellan Jr., son of the Civil War general, was supposed to start the train and then hand the controls over to a professional motorman. But McClellan was having too much fun. He refused to give up the stick. He drove the very first subway train all the way from City Hall to 103rd Street himself. The subway was an instant hit. It cost a nickel. It was clean at the time. The stations were beautiful, decorated with mosaics and faience tile. You could travel from the teeming slums of the Lower East Side to the open fields of Harlem in 20 minutes. This unleashed a real estate explosion. Harlem, which had been a quiet suburb, was suddenly accessible. Developers built rows of beautiful brownstones and apartment buildings, expecting wealthy white commuters, but the market was soft. They had overbuilt. Into this void stepped Philip A. Payton Jr., a black real estate entrepreneur. He saw an opportunity. Black New Yorkers were being squeezed out of the Tenderloin and San Juan Hill, where Lincoln Center is now, by violence and demolition. They needed somewhere to go. Payton started filling the empty apartments in Harlem with black tenants. White landlords tried to stop him. Residents tried to sue. But money talks. The Great Migration was beginning. Black Americans fleeing the Jim Crow South, and they poured into Harlem. By the 1920s, Harlem would become the cultural capital of Black America, the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington, the Cotton Club, the Savoy Ballroom. It was an explosion of art, music, and literature. that redefined American culture. But while the city was spreading out, tragedy struck again, reminding everyone that this machine was fueled by human bodies. March 25, 1911. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. The factory was on the top 3 floors of the Ash Building in Greenwich Village, now part of NYU. It employed mostly young immigrant women, Jewish and Italian girls, some as young as 14. They made shirtwaists, the fashionable blouses of the day. The owners, Blank and Harris, were paranoid about theft. They locked the exit doors to the stairwells to prevent the girls from stealing scraps of fabric or taking unauthorized breaks. A fire started in a rag bin. It spread instantly through the flammable cotton and tissue paper. The girls tried to run. The doors were locked. The fire escape was a flimsy, rusted iron structure that collapsed under the weight of the fleeing workers, sending them falling to their deaths in the courtyard. The fire department arrived, but their ladders only reached the 6th floor. The girls were on the 9th. Trapped by the flames, facing a horrific death, the women began to jump. They held hands, they jumped in pairs. The crowd on the street watched in horror as bodies hit the sidewalk. 146 people died. The city was devastated. But this time, the grief turned into action. A fierce woman named Frances Perkins, who witnessed the fire from the street and would later become FDR's Secretary of Labor, said, "It was the day the New Deal was born." New York established the Factory Investigating Commission. They rewrote the labor laws. They mandated fire sprinklers, unlocked doors, outward swinging exits, the fire code of New York City, and really, the workplace safety laws of the United States were written in the ashes of the Triangle Fire. As the city reformed its insides, it continued to armor its outside. The skyline was changing again. The skyscraper race was on. It was an ego contest between billionaires. In 1913, the Woolworth Building opened. Frank Woolworth, the 5 and dime king, paid $13,500,000, 0 cents in cash for it. It was a Gothic cathedral of commerce, complete with gargoyles, one of which is actually a caricature of the architect, holding a model of the building. For 17 years it was the tallest building in the world. But the Roaring Twenties brought a new energy. The stock market was booming, jazz was playing, prohibition was in full swing, which just meant you had to whisper a password to get a drink, and the architects were bored with the old heavy styles. They wanted something new, something modern. Art Deco. This is the style of New York. Sleek vertical lines, setbacks, geometric patterns, chrome and steel. The race for the sky peaked in 1929-1930. 3 buildings were vying for the title of world's tallest. 40 Wall Street, the Trump Building today, the Chrysler Building, at past. There is no skyscraper ever built. Walter Chrysler, the car magnate, wanted a monument to himself. The architect William Van Allen kept the final height a secret. When 40 Wall Street topped out, they thought they had won. But Van Allen had a trick up his sleeve. Inside the fire shaft of the Chrysler Building, he had secretly assembled a 125-foot steel spire. On the day of completion, he hoisted it up and bolted it into place. Boom! The Chrysler Building was taller. It held the record for exactly 11 months. Because Midtown, a few blocks away, Al Smith and John Raskob were building the Empire State Building. The construction of the Empire State Building is a miracle of logistics. They built it in 1 year and 45 days. They were rising at a rate of 4.5 stories per week. The steel workers, many of them Mohawk ironworkers from Canada, famous for their lack of fear of heights, walked on beams 80 stories up with no safety harnesses. They tossed red-hot rivets into buckets like they were playing cat. It opened on May 1, 1931. President Hoover turned on the lights from Washington. But here's the irony. It opened right in the teeth of the Great Depression. The stock market had crashed in October 1929. The party was over. Nobody could afford to rent office space. For years it was called the Empty State Building. It didn't make a profit until 1950. But as a symbol, it was priceless. It was King Kong's jungle gym. It was the beacon of New York. The Depression hit New York hard. The Hoovervilles, shantytowns sprang up in Central Park. The bread lines stretched around the block. The glitz of the Jazz Age was replaced by the grime of survival. But New York had a champion, a man who was equal parts builder and destroyer, a man who would reshape the city more than anyone since the glaciers, a man who was Robert Moses. We cannot tell the story of modern New York without Robert Moses. He was never elected to anything, but he held a dozen appointed positions simultaneously. He was the Parks Commissioner, the Bridge and Tunnel Authority head, the construction coordinator. He had absolute power, and he loved concrete. Moses looked at New York and saw a city that was obsolete. He hated the old crowded neighborhoods. He hated the subway. He never learned to drive, but he loved cars. He wanted highways. He wanted parks. He wanted order. In the 1930s, using massive amounts of New Deal money from the federal government, he went to work. He built the Triborough Bridge, he built the Grand Central Parkway, he built Jones Beach and the parkways to get there, with bridges intentionally too low for buses so that poor people couldn't easily visit. A nasty bit of class warfare baked into the architecture. He built public swimming pools, huge, magnificent pools like the one in McCarran Park in Astoria Park. He believed in recreation, but he also believed in the meat axe. To build his highways, he bulldozed entire neighborhoods. He evicted thousands of people. He cut the Bronx in half with the Cross Bronx Expressway, a scar the borough has never fully recovered from. Moses was a complex titan. He got things done when nobody else could. He transformed the city from a 19th century port into a 20th century metropolis. But he did it with a cold, technocratic arrogance that ignored the human cost. While Moses was pouring concrete, the city's heart was still beating in its neighborhoods. Let's talk about the culture of the 30s and 40s. Swing Street, 52nd Street. The jazz clubs, Billie Holiday singing Strange Fruit at Cafe Society in the Village, the first integrated nightclub, the Yankees, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig. Baseball wasn't just a sport, it was a religion. The rivalry between the Yankees, Bronx, the Giants, Manhattan, and the Dodgers, Brooklyn, divided family. If you were a Brooklyn Dodgers fan, you were a long-suffering romantic. Wait till next year was the mantra. And then World War II. New York was the principal port of embarkation. 3 million troops shipped out of New York Harbor to fight the Nazis. The Brooklyn Navy Yard was the busiest shipyard in the world. It employed 70,000 people working 24 hours a day, building battleships like the USS Missouri. The city was dimed out, blackout regulations to avoid U-boat targeting. Times Square went dark, but the energy was frantic. Soldiers and sailors on leave, trying to live a lifetime in 48 hours. When the war ended, Vive NJ Day, August 14th, 1945, Times Square exploded. That famous photo of the sailor kissing the nurse, that was the release of 4 years of anxiety. New York had survived the Depression and the war. It was now the undisputed capital of the world. London was bombed out. Paris was recovering. Berlin was rubble. New York was intact, rich and powerful. The United Nations chose New York for its headquarters, not Geneva, not London, New York. The Rockefellers donated the land along the East River, which was slaughterhouses at the time. The world's diplomats came to Manhattan to argue about peace, but the seeds of decline were already being sown. The GI Bill and the new highways, thanks Moses, made it easy to move to the suburbs. Long Island, Levittown, New Jersey, the middle class began to leave. They wanted a lawn, a garage, and quiet. They left the city to the poor, the rich, and the bohemians. And the Dodgers. Oh, the Dodgers. In 1957, Walter O'Malley moved the Brooklyn Dodgers to Los Angeles. The Giants moved to San Francisco. To a New Yorker, this is still considered a war crime. It ripped the soul out of Brooklyn. It signaled the end of the old neighborhood loyalty. It was the ultimate corporate betrayal. As we move into the 1960s, the city is about to enter its taxi driver phase. The gleaming metropolis is about to get gritty. The 1964 World's Fair in Queens, another Robert Moses project, was a vision of the future: jetpacks, picture phones, peace through understanding. But just a few miles away, the city was fraying. The manufacturing jobs were leaving. The tax base was shrinking. Crime was rising. The heroin epidemic was starting. But before the darkness fully sets in, there is one last stand for the old neighborhoods. Dane Jacobs vs. Robert Moses. Moses wanted to build the Lomax Madison, the Lower Manhattan Expressway. It would have cut straight through Soho and Little Italy. It would have destroyed Washington Square Park. It would have turned downtown Manhattan into a highway interchange. Jane Jacobs, a writer and mother living on Hudson Street in the Village, said no. She wasn't a planner. She was a citizen. She wrote a book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which argued that cities need messy, mixed-use neighborhoods with eyes on the street, not sterile highways and housing projects. She organized, she protested, she disrupted hearings. She was the David to Moses' Goliath, and she won. The Lomex was cancelled. Soho was saved. It was the first time Moses had been beaten. It marked the end of the era of the master builder and the beginning of the era of community preservation. So, as the sun sets on the 1960s, New York is a city in transition. The skyscrapers are tall, but the streets are getting mean. The counterculture is blooming in the East Village. The Velvet Underground is playing at the balloon farm. Warhol is in his factory. The party is getting weird, and the hangover is going to be brutal. The hangover didn't just hurt, it nearly killed the patient. Welcome to the 1970s. If the 1920s were a champagne toast, the 1970s were a cigarette butt floating in a puddle of lukewarm beer. The city was broke. I don't mean tight budget broke. I mean checking under the sofa cushions for spare change to pay the cops broke. The tax base had fled to the suburbs. The manufacturing jobs had moved south or overseas. The welfare rolls were exploding. And the city government, in a display of accounting gymnastics that would make Enron blush, had been borrowing money to pay for operating expenses for years. In 1975, the banks finally said no more. The city ran out of cash. It couldn't pay its bills. It couldn't pay its workers. It was facing default. Mayor Abe Bema, a tiny, tired-looking accountant of a man, went to Washington to beg for a bailout. President Gerald Ford, a Republican who looked at New York as a den of liberal sin and mismanagement, basically told him to drop dead. The Daily News ran the most famous headline in the history of journalism on October 30, 1975. Ford to city, drop dead. The city was saved at the last minute, literally hours before default, by the Teachers' Union Pension Fund, which agreed to buy municipal bonds. But the price was steep. A severe austerity board, the Emergency Financial Control Board, took over the city's finances. They fired thousands of cops, firefighters, and sanitation workers. They turned off the street lights to save electricity. The result? The city went dark, and the darkness brought the wolves. Crime skyrocketed. The murder rate hit all-time highs. The subway became a rolling graffiti canvas that smelled of urine and danger. There were mugging squads in the parks. The NYPD actually printed a pamphlet for tourists called Welcome to Fear City. It had a skull on the cover. It gave helpful advice like, do not leave your hotel after 6 p.m., do not take the subway, and hold your handbag tightly with both hands. This wasn't hyperbole, this was life. And then, just when you thought it couldn't get more apocalyptic, the lights went out for real. July 13, 1977, a lightning strike hit a substation on the Hudson River. The entire city, except for a few pockets in Queens, lost power. In 1965, when the blackout happened, people helped each other. They directed traffic. They sang songs. In 1977, the social contract had snapped. Looting started almost immediately. It was widespread. Broadway in Brooklyn, the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, storefront gates were ripped open with tow trucks. People were stealing everything. TVs, clothes, washing machines, diapers. 1,600 stores were looted. Over 1,000 fires were set. It was a night of rage. It was the poor of the city saying, if the system is broken, we're taking what we can get. But amidst the rubble of the Bronx, which was literally burning block by block, as landlords torched their own buildings for insurance money because they couldn't collect rent, something magical was happening. Hip-hop was being born. In the rec room of a crumbling apartment building at 1520 Cedric Avenue in the Bronx, a Jamaican immigrant named DJ Kool Herc threw a back-to-school party in 1973. He had a massive sound system. He realized that the crowd loved the break, the drum solo part of a funk record. So he used 2 turntables to extend the break, looping it over and over. The break boys started dancing. Then came the MCs, masters of ceremony, to talk over the beat. While the city was dying, the kids in the Bronx were inventing a global culture. They used the spray paint cans to turn the subway trains into moving art galleries. They used the cardboard boxes from refrigerators to break dance on the sidewalk. They took the ruins and made them rhythmic. Downtown, a different kind of revolution was happening at a dive bar on the Bowery called CBGB. The Ramones, Patti Smith, television, Blondie, Talking Heads, punk rock. It was stripped down. It was fast. It was angry. It was the sound of kids who had no future, so they decided to make a lot of noise in the present. The Bowery was a skid row of flophouses and alcoholics, but inside that club, the energy was nuclear. And then there was the disco. If CBGB was the gutter, Studio 54 was the penthouse. Opened in 1977 by Steve Rubell and Ian Schrager in an old opera house on 54th Street, it was the ultimate escape. The door policy was brutal. If you weren't famous, beautiful, or weird enough, you didn't get in. Inside it was Sodom and Gomorrah with a glitter ball, Bianca Jagger riding a white horse on the dance floor, Andy Warhol snapping photos. The drugs were prevalent. It was a hedonistic bubble floating above a city in crisis. So, picture 1977. You have the Bronx burning. You have Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, terrorizing the lovers' lanes, shooting people with a .44 caliber revolver and writing crazy letters to Jimmy Breslin. You have the blackout, you have Reggie Jackson hitting 3 home runs in the World Series for the Yankees. You have punk, you have disco, you have hip-hop. It was the most intense, creative, dangerous and vibrant year in the city's history. As the ATS rolled in, the mood shifted. The greed is good era arrived. Wall Street woke up. The bull market began. The yuppies, young urban professionals, appeared. They wore suspenders, drank white wine and bought loft apartments in Soho that used to be sweatshops. But alongside the money came 2 plagues. First, crack cocaine. It hit the streets in the mid-80s like a bomb. It was cheap, instantly addictive, and it destroyed entire neighborhoods. The violence associated with the crack trade made the 70s look like a picnic. In 1990, there were 2,245 murders in New York City. That's 6 people killed every single day. Second, AIDS. It started as a whisper, a gay cancer. Then it became a roar. The creative community of New York, the theatre world, the fashion world, the art world was decimated. Young men were wasting away and dying in St. Vincent's Hospital in the Village. The fear was palpable. People were afraid to touch doorknobs. But the activism was fierce. ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, staged die-ins at St. Patrick's Cathedral and on Wall Street. They demanded faster drug approval. They fought for their lives. New York in the ATS was a city of extreme contrasts. You had Donald Trump building Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue, all brass and pink marble, a monument to ATS excess. And a few blocks away in Times Square you had the Deuce, 42nd Street, which was a dystopian corridor of porn theatres, peep shows and hustlers. And then there was the Vigilante, December 22, 1984. Bernhard Goers, a skinny, bespectacled white man on the subway. 4 young black men approached him and asked for $5, 0 cents. Goers pulled out a .38 revolver and shot all 4 of them. The city was divided. To some he was a racist monster. To others, who were terrified of the crime, he was the subway vigilante, a hero who finally fought back. The tabloid headlines were screaming. It was a flashpoint for race relations in the city. Racial tension boiled over again in 1989 with the Central Park 5 case. A jogger was brutally attacked in the park. 5 teenagers from Harlem were arrested. The media convicted them before the trial even started. Donald Trump took out a full-page ad calling for the return of the death penalty. They were convicted. Years later, DNA evidence proved they were innocent, and someone else did it. But in 1989, The city was in a mood for vengeance, not justice. The chaos culminated in the Crown Heights riots in 1991. A Khan in the motorcade of a Hasidic rabbi accidentally struck and killed a black child, Gavin Cato. In retaliation, a group of black men stabbed a Jewish student, Yankel Rosenbaum. For 3 days, blacks and Jews fought in the streets of Brooklyn. The mayor at the time, David Dinkins, the first black mayor, was seen as ineffective. He hesitated. The police were held back. The city felt ungovernable. Enter Rudy Giuliani. In 1993, Giuliani won the mayoralty on a law and order platform. He was a prosecutor. He had no patience for the broken windows. The broken windows theory says that if you ignore small crimes, graffiti, turnstile jumping, squeegee men, it creates an atmosphere of lawlessness that invites bigger crimes. So, Giuliani cracked down. He unleashed the NYPD. William Bratton, the police commissioner, used CompStat, a computer system to track crime in real time, to deploy cops where the crime was happening, and the crime dropped precipitously. Now, criminologists still argue about why. Was it Giuliani? Was it the end of the crack epidemic? Was it the improving economy? Was it Roe v. Wade? Fewer unwanted children growing up into crime-prone ages? Probably a mix of all of them. But the visual change was undeniable. The graffiti was scrubbed off the trains. The squeegee men, guys who would wipe your windshield with a dirty rag and demand $1, were gone. The porn theatres in Times Square were evicted. Disney moved in. They renovated the new Amsterdam Theatre. The Lion King opened. Times Square, which had been the symbol of urban decay, became a neon-lit shopping mall for tourists from Iowa. The locals complained that it had been Disneyfied, that it had lost its soul. But nobody missed the muggings. The 90s ended with a dot-com boom. The city felt safe, rich, and invincible again. Sex and the City was on TV, selling a fantasy of New York as a playground for single women with $400 0-cent shoes. The nightmares of the 70s felt like ancient history, and then came a Tuesday morning in September 11, 2001. It was a primary election day. The sky was that specific, piercing, severe, clear blue. The first plane hit the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. Most people thought it was a terrible accident. A small plane? A pilot heart attack? Then the second plane hit the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. and we knew the world stopped. The city that never stops stopped. The silence in the sky, because all flights were grounded, was the weirdest part. We all know the horror of that day, the falling towers, the cloud of dust that chased people up Broadway like a sentient monster, the papers floating in the air all the way to Brooklyn, the smell, acrid burning plastic, pulverized concrete that lingered for months. But what stands out, looking back, is the humanity. The pile became hallowed ground. The firefighters and ironworkers, many descendants of the Mohawks who built the skyscrapers, working on the bucket brigades. The boat lift, this is an undertold story. When the towers fell, Manhattan was sealed off. No trains, no bridges. Hundreds of thousands of people were trapped in lower Manhattan, pushed to the water's edge by the dust cloud. The Coast Guard put out a radio call. All available boats, anyone who wants to help with the evacuation of lower Manhattan, report to Governor's Island. And they came. Ferries, tugboats, fishing boats, private yachts, party boats. It was a maritime Dunkirk. In 9 hours they evacuated 500,000 people by water. It was the largest sea evacuation in history. Regular people, captains and crews, just doing the work because it needed to be done. In the weeks after, the city was different. New Yorkers, usually so guarded, were making eye contact. We were asking, "Are you okay?" and meaning it. The missing person posters taped to every lamppost, phone booth and wall were heartbreaking, smiling faces at weddings and graduations, with phone numbers that would never ring again. Mayor Giuliani, for all his divisiveness later, was the voice the city needed in that moment. "The number of casualties will be more than any of us can bear," he said. He was present. He was steady. The rebuilding began. It was slow. It was political. There were arguments about the design, the memorial, the names. But eventually the Freedom Tower, One World Trade Center rose. It's not the Twin Towers. It's a single, faceted shard of glass. It's 1,776 feet tall, get it? It's defiant. The 2000S and 2010S saw the city morph again. Under Mayor Michael Bloomberg, a billionaire who paid himself $1.00 a year, the city became a luxury product. Bloomberg rezoned 40% of the city. He encouraged high-rise development. He banned smoking in bars, which seemed impossible, but now is standard. He created bike lanes and pedestrian plazas. He turned Times Square into a pedestrian zone with lawn chairs. The High Line opened, an old, elevated freight rail line in Chelsea that was going to be demolished was turned into a linear park. It became a global sensation. It also supercharged the gentrification of West Chelsea. The meat packing district, which used to be actual meat packers and transgender sex workers, became the home of high-end boutiques and the Standard Hotel. Brooklyn exploded. The brand of Brooklyn became a global signifier for artisans, cool, hipster. Williamsburg, once a gritty industrial neighborhood, became the center of the skinny jeans universe. The L train became the lifeline of the cool kids. Gentrification moved deeper. Bushwick, Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights, Harlem. The frontier of affordable rent kept moving further out, pushing long-time residents, mostly black and Latino families, further to the margins. The city was safer, cleaner, and prettier than ever, but it was also becoming a gated community for the rich. In 2012, nature reminded us that we are still an island in the Atlantic. Hurricane Sandy. The water surged into the harbor. It flooded the subway tunnels. It turned the Battery Tunnel into a swimming pool. It plunged lower Manhattan into darkness again. The hospitals had to evacuate babies down dark stairwells. In the Rockaways and Breezy Point, houses burned down because the floodwaters prevented fire trucks from reaching them. It was a wake-up call. Climate change wasn't theoretical. The water's rising. The city is vulnerable. And then 2020. The pandemic. New York was the epicenter, the siren city. For months the only sound on the streets was the wail of ambulances. We clapped at 7 p.m. every night from our windows for the essential workers. We saw freezer trucks parked outside hospitals as makeshift morgues. The city emptied out. The wealthy fled to the Hamptons or upstate. The media wrote "New York is dead" articles again. Jerry Seinfeld wrote an op-ed saying, basically, "Shut up, we're not dead, we'll be back." And we are back. But it's different. The office workers haven't all returned. Midtown is still trying to figure out what it is if it's not a beehive of commuters. The rents are back to insane levels. The rats are seemingly bolder than ever. we now have a rat czar. So, here we are, 2025. We are standing on the corner of 42nd and Broadway. Look around. You see the LED screens advertising Broadway shows. You see the Elmo characters. You see the tourists. But look deeper. Look at the ground. Beneath the asphalt is the bedrock that the glaciers scrubbed clean. Look at the street names. Wall Street, the wooden fence. Broadway, the Lenape Trail. Beaver Street, the fur trade. Maiden Lane, where the Dutch girls did laundry. Look at the faces, the same mix of hustlers, dreamers, refugees and sharks that have been walking these streets since Peter Stuyvesant stopped his peg leg. New York isn't just a place. It's an agreement. It's a shared hallucination. We agree to live on top of each other, to pay too much rent, to endure the noise and the smell, because we believe that this is where the action is. This is where you come to test yourself against the best. It's the greatest city in the world, and it's a terrible place, and I wouldn't live anywhere else. So having walked through 400 years of timeline, let's stop looking at the calendar and start looking at the anatomy. To really get New York, to understand why it hums and vibrates the way it does, you have to ignore the people for a second and look at the machine itself. You have to lift the hood. If you could slice Manhattan in half like a layer cake, you'd see that the city part, the part where we walk and drink coffee and dodge tourists, is just the frosting. The real action, the stuff that keeps the organism alive, is happening in the dark, usually about 20 to 800 feet beneath your boots. Let's descend. Right below the asphalt is a spaghetti bowl of chaos. It is a tangled mess of pipes, wires and tubes that has been accumulating since the Dutch. You have electric cables, fiber optic lines, gas mains, and the old pneumatic tubes that used to shoot mail around the city at 30 miles per hour. Yes, that was a real thing, like Futurama in 1897. But the most uniquely New York thing down there is the steam. You know that cinematic image of a New York street at night, a manhole cover rattling, spewing a column of white vapor into the neon light? It looks like a movie set, but it's actually a utility. New York has the largest district steam system in the world. It's run by Con Edison. There are 105 miles of steam pipes running under Manhattan, boiling water to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. This steam heats the Empire State Building, the UN, and thousands of other buildings. It sterilizes hospital equipment. It presses clothes in the garment district. The reason you see those orange and white striped smokestacks, New Yorkers call them chimneys, sitting in the middle of the street is to let the steam escape so the pressure doesn't blow the asphalt into the sky. It's a pressure cooker, and sometimes it fails. When a steam pipe bursts, it's not a leak, it's an explosion. It can cut a bus in half. It throws mud and rocks 40 stories into the air. Here's a reminder that we are walking on top of a dormant volcano of our own making. Go deeper, past the steam, past the basement foundations. We hit the subway. We talked about the history of the subway, but let's talk about the reality of it. It is a 24-hour industrial environment that we all just casually step into in our business casual clothes. It is hot. In the summer, the subway platforms can be 10 to 15 degrees hotter than the street. Why? Because trains have air conditioning. And where does an air conditioner pump the hot air? Outside, into the tunnel. So every time a cool train arrives, it is blasting heat into the station. It's a thermodynamic loop of misery. and the dust. If you look at the tracks, you see a black fluffy grime. That is mostly steel dust. It's the result of millions of steel wheels grinding against steel rails for 100 years. It's magnetic. If you dragged a magnet through a subway tunnel, it would come out looking like a fuzzy caterpillar. But the most fascinating thing about the subway is the block signal system. If you're ever stuck on a train and the conductor says, "We are being held by the train dispatch lane the 1930S." Most of the subway runs on technology that predates World War II. It uses fixed block signaling. Basically, the track is divided into sections. If a train is in section A, the light for section B turns red. No other train can enter. It's safe, but it's inefficient. The system doesn't know where in the section the train is, just that it's there. So trains have to keep massive distances between them. They are slowly updating to CBTC, communications-based train control, which uses Wi-Fi to let the trains talk to each other so they can run closer together. But upgrading the NYC subway is like trying to change the tires on a car while it is driving 60 miles per hour down the highway. You can't just shut it down. New York doesn't sleep, so the maintenance has to happen while the beast is awake. Now, let's go deeper still, deeper than the subway, deeper than the pilings of the skyscrapers. We are entering the world of the sandhogs. The sandhogs are the urban miners of New York, Local 147. They are a legendary union of tunnel workers who have dug every major tunnel in the city: the Lincoln, the Holland, the subway, the water tunnels. It is a hereditary trade. Grandfathers, fathers, and sons work in the dark. It is incredibly dangerous. In the old days, the rule of thumb was one dead man for every mile of tunnel. They face cave-ins, explosions, and the bends. Right now, and for the last 50 years, they have been digging City Water Tunnel No. 3. This is the greatest infrastructure project you've never heard of. It started in 1970. It won't be finished until, well, nobody really knows. Maybe 2030. Here is the problem. New York gets its water from upstate reservoirs through two massive tunnels. Tunnel No. 1 1917 and Tunnel 2 1936. They are old, they are brittle, and they have never been inspected, not once, because if you shut them off to inspect them, the city runs out of water in a day. It's like having a house with old plumbing that you can never turn off to fix. So they are building Tunnel No. 3 as a backup. When it's done, they can finally close the valves on the old tunnels and see what kind of nightmares are living in there. Tunnel No. 3 is huge, 24 feet in diameter. It runs 500 to 800 feet below the street. That's deeper than the height of the Woolworth building, inverted. Down there, the rock is billions of years old. The sandhogs blast it with dynamite, shore it up with concrete, and keep moving. It is a silent, violent war against the geology of the earth, happening while you sleep. There are legends down there too. Let's talk about the mole people. In the 1980s and 90s, when the homeless crisis was at its peak, communities of people moved into the abandoned tunnels. The most famous was the Freedom Tunnel under Riverside Park. It was an Amtrak tunnel that wasn't being used. People built actual houses down there. They had electricity hooked up to the streetlights. They had furniture. They had hierarchies. There was a guy called the Lord of the Tunnel. It was a functioning society in total darkness. Journalist Jennifer Toth wrote a book about it called The Mole People. Some of it was exaggerated, There were no albino mutants fighting wars, but the reality was stark enough. When Amtrak decided to reactivate the tunnel in the 90s, the police and social workers had to go down and evict hundreds of people who hadn't seen the sun in months. And then there are the secret stations. If you stay on the 6 train after it terminates at Brooklyn Bridge, City Hall, the train does a U-turn to go back uptown. As it screeches around the loop, look out the window. You will see a ghost station. Is the original City Hall station from 1904. It is stunning. Guastavino tile arches, skylights, brass chandeliers. It's a jewel box, but it was built on a curve. As trains got longer and straighter, the gap between the train and the platform became too dangerous. They closed it in 1945. It's still there, perfectly preserved, a time capsule covered in brake dust. Or Track 61. Under the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, there is a secret train platform. It was built for VIPs. Franklin D. Roosevelt used it. His private train car, carrying his limousine, would pull in, a massive elevator would lift the limo with the president inside, straight up into the hotel garage. It was how he hid his polio disability from the public. He could go from DC to his hotel suite without anyone seeing him in a wheelchair. One day when I was living in France, I went to see the menu pot in the hotel. The station is still there. It's derelict, full of squalor and rust, but the Secret Service still secures it when the president is in town, just in case they need an escape route. But we can't talk about the underground without talking about the true landlords of the tunnels, the rats. Ratus norvegus, the brown rat. They are the unofficial mascot of the MTA. New York rats are a different breed. They are smart, they are bold. They have been observed looking both ways before crossing the street. I'm not joking. The war on rats is eternal and unwinnable. We poison them, we trap them. We use dry ice to suffocate them in their burrows. Mayor Giuliani appointed a rat czar. Mayor Adams appointed a director of rodent mitigation. Salary, $155,000. 0 cents. But the rats are winning. They reproduce too fast. A pair of rats can produce 15,000 descendants in a year if left unchecked. And they are evolving. They are learning to avoid traps. They are becoming immune to certain poisons. They are adapting to our schedule. They know when the garbage trucks come. They know when the drunk people drop pizza slices. Pizza Rat was an internet hero, but to a sanitation worker, he's just Tuesday. There is a begrudging respect between New Yorkers and rats. We both live in small apartments. We both eat garbage on the go, and we are both survivors. We just try to stay out of each other's lanes. But it's not just rats down there. There is water. Manhattan was once Manahatta, island of many hills and streams. When we paved the city, we didn't delete the streams. We just buried them. Minetta Brook, it used to flow through Greenwich Village. It's still there. It runs through the basement of an apartment building on 12th Street. The superintendent has to pump it out every day. There are restaurants in the village where, if you listen closely in the basement, you can hear rushing water behind the walls. Canal Street is named Canal Street because it was a canal that drained the Collect Pond. The water is still there, seeping into the sub-basements of Chinatown, fighting to turn the neighborhood back into a swamp. And then there are the eels. Yes, eels. In the water pipes. The tiny glass eels migrate from the Sargasso Sea to the Hudson River. Sometimes they get into the water system before they are filtered out. There have been stories, mostly from the old days, but some recent, of people turning on a tap and seeing a wiggle. It's rare, but it's a reminder that we are drinking from a living river. So, when you lay your head down in a New York apartment and you feel that subtle vibration in the floor, that low frequency, don't be alarmed, it's just the subway carrying the night shift. It's the steam rushing through the veins of the city. It's the water moving through the tunnels carved by the sandhogs. It's the millions of rats scurrying through the dark. The city is a living thing, and like any living thing, it has a heartbeat, a digestive system, and a nervous system. We just live on the skin. But if the underground is the guts of the city, the sky is its soul. We've looked down. Now we have to look up, to the steel walkers, the window washers, and the birds that think these canyons are cliffs. We've crawled through the mud with the sandhogs and dodged the rats on the third rail. Now hit the button for the observation deck. We're going up. If the underground is the city's gut, the skyline is its ego. It's a jagged graph of ambition, money, and physics. But here's the thing about New York. Even the empty air is for sale. It's called air rights. In most places, if you own a building, you own the sky above it until you hit outer space. In New York, that empty space is a commodity. It's an asset class. Let's say you own a little 3-story deli next to a massive skyscraper. You aren't using the air above your deli. The developer next door wants to build higher than the zoning laws allow, so he writes you a check for $10 million. You don't sell him your building, you sell him your air. He takes your unused vertical space and stacks it on top of his building. That's why you see those pencil towers on Billionaires Row, those skinny needle-like buildings that sway in the wind. They are built on tiny lots, but they have purchased the air rights from every building in the neighborhood. They are literally monuments to the commodification of nothingness. But who actually builds these things? Who walks out on a steel beam 80 stories up, with the wind whipping at 40 miles an hour, and bolts the skeleton of the city together? For 4 generations, the answer has been the Mohawk. This is one of the most incredible specific subcultures in New York history. The Mohawk people, specifically from the Kanawake and Akwesasne reservations near Montreal, are the legendary skywalkers of the steel trade. It started in 1886, when a bridge was being built over the St. Lawrence River near their land. The construction company hired Mohawk men as day laborers to move supplies, but the foreman noticed something. The Mohawk men had no fear of heights. They would walk across the narrow beams hundreds of feet over the churning river as if they were walking down a sidewalk. They were sure-footed, possessing a physiological or psychological immunity to vertigo that baffled the white supervisors. They were trained as riveters and connectors, and when the bridge was done, they followed the steel. They came to New York in the 1920s and 30s. They built the Empire State Building, they built the Chrysler Building, they built the George Washington Bridge, they built the World Trade Center. For decades, there was a neighborhood in Boerum Hill, Brooklyn, centered around Atlantic Avenue, that was essentially Little Carnawac. The bars, like the Spa and the Wigwam, were filled with ironworkers speaking Mohawk, drinking beer after a shift of defying death. On weekends, they'd drive 12 hours back to Canada to see their families, then drive back Sunday night to catch the Monday morning shift. Booming out, they called it. It's a dangerous trade. The history of the Mohawks in New York is marked by tragedy. In 1907, the Quebec Bridge collapsed, killing 33 Mohawk men in seconds. It devastated the community. But they didn't stop. They kept climbing. There's a tradition that when a building is topped out, when the final steel beam is placed, they hoist an evergreen tree and an American flag onto the beam. It's a Scandinavian tradition originally, adopted by the ironworkers. It signals that the skeleton is done, and no one died, hopefully. It's an offering to the sky spirits. The next time you look at the skyline, realize it was woven together by indigenous men from Canada who treated the clouds like their backyard. Now, shift your gaze from the shiny steel to the rooftops. Look for the little wooden huts on stilts. They look like rustic cabins or misplaced wine barrels. Those are the water towers. There are about 15,000 of them in New York City. They are iconic. They are in every Spider-Man comic and every establishing shot of a gritty crime drama. But they aren't there for nostalgia. They are a crucial piece of technology that we still haven't improved upon. Here's the physics. The city's water mains rely on gravity and pumps to get water to your tap. But the pressure is only strong enough to push water up about 6 stories. If you live on the 7th floor or higher, turn on the tap, and nothing. So every building taller than 6 stories needs a reservoir on the roof. A pump in the basement pushes water up to the tank. Gravity pushes it down to your shower. Where? Simple. But why wood? Why do we store our drinking water in unpainted cedar planks that look like they belong in a Western saloon? 3 reasons. 1. Insulation. Wood is a great insulator. In the freezing New York winter, a steel tank would turn into a giant ice cube. The wood keeps the water liquid. 2. Maintenance. You can't build a steel tank on a roof easily. You have to crane it up. But a wooden tank? It comes in pieces, stabies and hoops. You can bring it up in the freight elevator and assemble it on the roof, like IKEA furniture. 3. The seal. This is the cool part. The tanks are not sealed with glue or cork. They are held together by metal hoops. When you fill the tank with water, the dry cedar wood absorbs the water and expands. The wood swells against the hoops, creating a perfectly watertight seal. It's a self-sealing organic machine. There are only 2 or 3 family companies left in NYC that build these tanks. The Rosenwach Tank Company is the big one. If you see a tank with a little wooden finial on top, that's a Rosenwach signature. It's a dying art, but the city can't live without it. So yes, your pristine filtered water is sitting in a rotting wooden bucket on the roof that hasn't been changed in 30 years, collecting bird poop on the lid. Don't think about it too much. Speaking of birds, let's talk about the apex predators of Fifth Avenue. New York City is accidentally the perfect habitat for the peregrine falcon and the red-tailed hawk. Think about it. What does a falcon want? It wants a high cliff to nest on, safe from ground predators. It wants updrafts to soar on, and it wants an endless supply of slow, stupid food. Manhattan provides all of this. The skyscrapers are the cliffs. The window ledges are the caves. The heat rising from the concrete creates thermal updrafts that allow them to glide for hours without flapping a wing. And the pigeons? The pigeons are an all-you-can-eat buffet that never closes. The most famous of these urban dinosaurs was Pale Male. He was a red-tailed hawk who decided in 1991 that he was going to live at 927 Fifth Avenue. This is one of the most exclusive co-op buildings in the world. It's where Mary Tyler Moore lived. Pale male built a nest on the cornice right above a window. He became a celebrity. People set up telescopes in Central Park to watch him bring dead rats and pigeons to his mate. He was the king of the park. But in 2004, the co-op board decided the nest was messy. They hired workers to rip it down. Big mistake. The outcry was insane. It wasn't just birdwatchers. It was Mary Tyler Moore. It was the general public. People protested outside the building, wearing hawk costumes. They shamed the billionaires into submission. The co-op board apologized and installed a metal cradle to help pale male rebuild his nest. It was a classic New York story. A squatter with a lot of attitude defeats the landlords. But the sky isn't just for birds and tanks. It's also the workplace of the bravest window washers on Earth. When you look at a building like the One World Trade Center or the jagged edge of the Hearst Tower, ask yourself, how do you clean that? The squeegee men of the sky are a different breed. On standard buildings they use a scaffold, but on the weird, modern, sculptural buildings they have to rappel. They are basically industrial alpinists. They harness up, clip onto a bolt 90 stories in the air, and drop over the side with a bucket of soapy water. The wind up there is violent. It swirls around the corners of the buildings, creating vortexes that can slam a washer against the glass. They have suction cups to hold themselves steady, and they see everything. There's a code among window washers. What happens in the apartment stays in the apartment. They see affairs. They see nudity. They see illegal drug deals. They see people crying. They are the silent, hovering voyeurs of the metropolis. They float by your 50th floor window like ghosts, wipe away the grime, and vanish. Finally, we have to talk about the light. New York is a canyon system. Most of the time on the street you are in shadow, but twice a year, usually in May and July, the cosmos aligns with the Commissioner's Plan of 1811. It's called Manhattan Henge. Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist and director of the Hayden Planetarium in NYC, coined the term because the street grid is tilted slightly off true east-west, about 29 degrees. The sun sets perfectly in alignment with the east-west cross streets on these specific dates. On a Manhattan Henge evening, 42nd Street, 34th Street, 14th Street, they turn into cathedrals of light. The sun sits right on the horizon, framed perfectly by the buildings on either side. The light shoots down the canyon, blinding and golden. It triggers a modern pagan ritual. Thousands of people run into the middle of the street, blocking traffic, holding up their phones to capture the sun. Cab drivers honk and scream, but the crowd doesn't care. For 10 minutes, the city stops to worship the alignment of geometry and astronomy. It's one of the few moments where you feel the island's position on the planet. And then the sun dips. The light turns purple, then blue. The streetlights flicker on. The spell breaks. But what is it like to live up there? To be one of the cloud people? The penthouse. It's the ultimate New York dream. But it's a weird existence. I once visited a penthouse on the 80th floor of a new super tall tower. The elevator ride took so long my ears popped twice. When the doors opened, the silence hit me. Down on the street, the city is a roar. Sirens, jackhammers, shouting. Up there, it's dead silent. You can't hear the taxis. You can't hear the people. You are watching a silent movie of the city below. The cars look like toys. The people are invisible specks. The weather is different. It can be raining at the bottom of the building and sunny at the top, or vice versa. You are disconnected from the energy that makes New York, New York. It's a God-complex view. You feel powerful, but you also feel lonely. You are in the city, but not of it. And maybe that's the ultimate tragedy of the skyline. We build these towers to cram as many people as possible onto this tiny island. But the higher we go, the further apart we get. As night falls on the city, look at the lights. Look at the blinking red lights on the radio antennas, warning the planes. Look at the soft white glow of the Empire State Building's spire, or whatever color it is tonight. Red for Valentine's, green for Earth Day, rainbow for Pride. Look at the harsh blue light of the office floors, where the cleaning crews are working the night shift. The city is a constellation, a man-made galaxy. We have dug into the mud, we have scraped the sky. We have built a machine that eats money and spits out culture. But machines break, machines rust, machines eventually stop. Or do they? We've reached the top, we've seen the view, now it's time to come back down. To ground level, to the pillow. The story is almost over. The city is winding down, or at least shifting gears. The elevator descent from the penthouse is faster than your stomach expects. Your ears pop again, pressurizing you back to reality. The doors slide open. Ding! You step out onto the sidewalk. It's 3:30 a.m. This is the secret hour. The city that never sleeps is a marketing slogan. The city absolutely sleeps. It just naps in shifts. And right now, between the last call at the dive bars and the first shift of the bakery trucks, there is a lull, a heavy metallic pause. The air is cool. It smells of ozone, old coffee, and the salty dampness of the harbour. The roar of the day has faded into a low, steady hum, like a refrigerator working in the other room. Walk with me for a block. The traffic lights are still working, cycling through their colours for an audience of no one. Red, green, yellow, red. It's a robotic ballet performed for empty asphalt. A yellow taxi cruises by, its off-duty light glowing. It moves slowly, the tires hissing on the damp pavement. The driver is just gliding, maybe heading home to Queens, maybe just enjoying the rare freedom of a road without brake lights. The only real activity belongs to the monsters of the night, the garbage trucks. They are the white noise of New York sleep. They grind and gnash their metal teeth, compressing the day's debris, the Starbucks cups, the pizza boxes, the broken umbrellas, into oblivion. They are resetting the stage, wiping the slate clean so we can dirty it all over again tomorrow. Pass a bodega on the corner. The fluorescent lights are humming. Inside, the clerk is dozing on a stool behind the plexiglass. A Spanish radio station playing softly. On top of the ATM, the bodega cat is curled into a tight, furry comma, fast asleep. He doesn't care about history. He doesn't care about stock markets or zoning laws. He just knows that the machine is warm. Look down at the street. You see those metal plates covering a hole in the road? Steel plates. They are the band-aids of the city. When a car drives over them, clank, clank, it echoes off the brick buildings. It's the heartbeat of the infrastructure. It feels permanent, doesn't it? The brick, the iron, the concrete, But remember what we talked about. This is all just a crust, a temporary shell built on a wild, swampy island. If you stop walking and just stand still, really still, you can almost feel the ghosts brushing past you. The Lenape checking their oyster traps in the moonlight. The Dutch night watchman rattling his wooden clacker to scare off thieves. The redcoat soldier shivering at his post near the battery. The Irish labourer stumbling home from McSorley's in 1860. The flapper girl laughing as she spills out of a speakeasy in 1925. They are all right here. The timeline isn't a line, it's a stack. We are just the layer currently on top. We are the current tenants of the bedrock, and the bedrock is patient. The Manhattan schist, that hard, grey stone that anchors the skyscrapers, it was here 500 million years before us, and it will be here 500 million years after the last neon sign flickers out. It doesn't mind the weight, it holds us up, silent and strong. Let's drift away from the street now. Let's float up, one last time, just above the rooftops, and drift out over the harbour. The water is black and glossy like oil. The currents are swirling, the Hudson meeting the East River, the fresh water mixing with the salt. The tide is going out, pulling the city's secrets out to the Atlantic. Look at the boroughs. To the south, Staten Island is dark and quiet, a suburban blanket of trees and hills, sleeping soundly. The ferry is just a small orange beetle, chugging slowly across the black water, its wake spreading out in a white fan. To the east, Brooklyn is a vast quilt of brownstone and brick. The lights are mostly out, the stoops are empty. The artisanal coffee shops are closed. The promenade is empty, save for a few runners chasing the dawn. Up north, the Bronx is settling down. The trains in the yards are parked in rows, sleeping giants waiting for the morning rush. The zoo is quiet, the animals pacing softly in their dreams. And Queens is humming low. The 7 train rattles softly on its elevated track, carrying the night shift workers, the nurses, the cleaners, the bakers, home to their beds. And back in the center, Manhattan. He sees the milling mass of homes, homes to the archaists, homes to the sorders, homes to the homeless, homes to the homeless sorders, homes to the homeless, homes to the homeless, homes to the homeless, homes to the homes, homes to the homes, homes to the homes, homes to the homes in bed, the island of hills, the island of ambition. It glows like embers in a fireplace that is slowly dying down. The office towers are dim. The frenetic energy has unspooled. The city is recharging. It's taking a deep breath. The chaos of history. The fires, the riots, the drafts, the crashes, the booms. It all smooths out from this distance. It's just a story. A long, complicated, beautiful, messy story that we are all writing together, line by line, day by day. But for now, the pen is down, the page is full, the steam rises gently from the vents, curling into the night air, disappearing like a whisper. The tugboats in the harbour gently bump against their tires, rocking in the tide. The pigeons are tucked under the eaves of the library, heads under wings. The noise fades. The sirens are far away, just a faint wail in another neighbourhood. The honking has stopped. There is only the rhythm of the water against the bulkhead. Slap, swish, slap, swish. The island is drifting, anchored to the rock, but floating in time. It's okay to let go now. The city has got this. The sandhogs are watching the tunnels, the police are watching the streets, the steam is moving through the pipes. You don't have to watch anymore. You can close your eyes. Imagine the snow falling on New Amsterdam. Quiet, soft, white flakes covering the mud. Imagine the fog rolling in over the Brooklyn Bridge, wrapping the cables in cotton. Imagine the sun setting over the Hudson, turning the river to gold, then copper, then violet, then black. The grid is fading. The lines are blurring. The hard angles of the city are softening into pillows. Sleep now. The city will be here when you wake up. Loud, crazy, impossible New York. But for tonight, silence. Good night, Manhattan. Good night, Brooklyn. Good night, Queens. Good night, Bronx. Good night, Staten Island. Good night, you. The end. Sweet dreams.